I remember the road because it wasn't supposed to be there. That's the first thing that felt wrong. I had been driving for hours already, following a narrow highway that cut through long stretches of empty land. Snow had started falling sometime after sunset. At first it was light, just small flakes drifting across the windshield. But by the time the sky turned completely dark, the snow had grown thicker, heavier. It moved in slow waves like the air itself was breathing. My phone had lost signal a long time ago. I didn't mind at first. I actually liked the quiet. No notifications, no voices, just the sound of the engine and the soft rhythm of the wipers pushing snow aside. I was heading toward a town I'd never been to before, just passing through, really. A place with a cheap motel and a name I barely remembered. I had the route saved earlier and I wasn't worried. It was supposed to be a straight drive. But then I saw the road. It appeared on my left without warning. A narrow turn almost hidden beneath the snow. No sign, no markings, just a thin break in the trees where the ground dipped slightly like something had pressed it down over time. I slowed the car. I don't know why I noticed it. I could have easily driven past. Most people would have, but something about it made me ease my foot off the gas. The headlights brushed across it for only a second, but in that second I felt it. A quiet pull. Not strong, not sudden, just a soft feeling like recognition. I checked my map. There was nothing there. Just a blank stretch of forest. I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for something to load, waiting for a road to appear, but it stayed empty. The blue line kept going forward, telling me to stay on the highway. And I should have. I know that now. But the snow was getting worse. The road ahead looked longer, darker, endless, and that small, hidden turn, it felt different, like a shortcut, like something that would lead somewhere closer. I told myself that. Just a shortcut. I turned the wheel. The car slipped slightly as the tires left the main road. Snow crunched underneath me, thicker here, untouched. I slowed down even more, gripping the wheel a little tighter. The trees closed in almost immediately. Tall, thin trunks packed close together. Their branches sagged under the weight of the snow. The headlights didn't reach very far anymore. The light just bounced back at me, swallowed by white. The road was barely a road. No lines, no edges, just two faint tracks like someone had driven here once a long time ago. I kept going. At first I thought I'd turn around after a minute, just check where it leads. But the deeper I went, the more the world behind me seemed to fade. The main highway, it already felt far away, too far to easily go back. The silence changed too. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was thick. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes you aware of every small sound inside the car. The hum of the engine, the soft creak of the dashboard, even my own breathing felt louder. I reached for the radio. Static, just a low, empty hiss. I turned it off. The road began to curve slowly, winding through the trees. I followed it without thinking too much. My eyes stayed fixed ahead, trying to see beyond the falling snow. And then I noticed something strange. There were no fresh tire tracks. The faint lines I had been following, they weren't new. They looked old, almost frozen into the ground beneath the snow, like they had been there for a long time and nothing had passed over them since. Not even animals. No footprint, no disturbances, just smooth, untouched snow on either side. I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. But I didn't stop. I told myself it was just the weather, just the snow covering everything. It made sense. It had been falling for hours. Still, something about it didn't feel right. I kept driving. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, it's hard to say. Time felt slower out there. The road stretched on, turning gently, never quite straight. The trees never changed. They all looked the same, dark shapes wrapped in white. I started to feel like I wasn't going anywhere, like I was just moving in place. That's when I saw the light. It was faint at first, a soft glow between the trees far ahead, warm in color, yellow, maybe orange, not like the cold blue of my headlights. I leaned forward slightly, squinting. The light stayed. It didn't move. A strange sense of relief washed over me. I hadn't realized how tense I had become until that moment. Seeing that light, it meant something was out here, something real. A house, a cabin, maybe even someone who could tell me where I was. I pressed the gas just a little. The car moved forward slowly, tires crunching through the snow. The light grew brighter as I got closer. The shape of something began to form around it. Wood, dark wood. A cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. The snow around it looked smoother than the road, untouched and even, a soft layer that reflected the warm glow coming from inside. There was a single window lit up, and a small porch. I stopped the car a few feet away. The engine idled quietly, the only sound in that frozen place. For a moment, I just sat there, looking at it. Something about the cabin felt still. Not abandoned, but not alive either. The light inside flickered slightly, like a fire. I could see shadows moving faintly across the window, but I couldn't tell what they were. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I opened the map. Nothing. No road, no cabin, no clearing. Just forest. I felt that knot in my chest tighten a little more. I looked back at the road behind me, but the road wasn't there anymore. I blinked, leaned forward. The place where I had driven in, it was gone. There was only snow, flat, smooth, unbroken. No tire tracks, not even mine. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. I knew I had just come from there. I had driven straight in. I hadn't turned. I hadn't stopped. But now there was nothing. Just a wide, empty stretch of white between the trees. The engine continued to hum softly. The cabin's light flickered again. And for the first time since I turned onto that road, I felt something I couldn't explain. Not fear. Not yet. Just a quiet, heavy thought settling in the back of my mind. A feeling that I had gone somewhere I wasn't supposed to find. I looked back at the cabin, the window, the moving shadows, and as I sat there, frozen between the car and the door, I noticed something else. The front door of the cabin was slowly opening, just a little at first, then a little more. No sound, no one visible, just darkness inside, and that soft, warm light behind it. Waiting. I don't remember deciding to go inside. That part feels blurred, like something soft pressed over that moment and smoothed it out. I remember sitting in the car, watching the cabin door open slowly. I remember the way the warm light touched the snow just outside the entrance. It looked safe, almost welcoming, too warm for a place like that. And I remember thinking that I couldn't stay in the car all night. The engine wouldn't last forever. The cold would get in eventually. So I stepped out. The air hit me right away. It was colder than I expected. Not sharp, not biting, just deep. The kind of cold that settles into your bones quietly. My boots sank into the snow as I walked toward the porch. I remember looking down once, noticing my footprints forming clearly behind me. Each step pressed deep and clean into the white surface. That detail stayed with me. I don't know why. The door was already open when I reached it. It didn't move anymore. It just waited there, slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it and stepped back inside. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, listening. Nothing. No voices. No movement. Just that same heavy silence I had felt on the road. But warmer. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Wood smoke. Old wood, dry and aged, and something else beneath it, faint but there, like damp fabric that had been left too long in the dark. The cabin was small, one main room, a table, a chair, a narrow bed against the wall, and a fireplace glowing softly on the far side. The fire inside it burned low, steady, almost too steady. It didn't crackle much, it didn't shift, it just held its shape. Like it wasn't really fire. I closed the door behind me without thinking. The sound was quiet, but it felt heavy, final. I remember calling out. Just a simple hello. My voice sounded strange in that space, too soft, like the walls were absorbing it. No one answered. I walked a little further in, my boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. The room felt warmer the closer I got to the fire, but the air near the walls still held that cold, damp feeling. There were things in the cabin. Small things. A cup on the table, a coat hanging near the door, a pair of boots by the wall. They looked used, not abandoned, but no one was there. I told myself someone must have stepped out. Maybe they saw my car. Maybe they were watching from somewhere outside. That thought made me glance back at the door. It stayed closed. Still, I didn't open it again. I don't remember sitting down, but at some point I did, near the fire. I held my hands out toward it, letting the warmth settle into my fingers. I must have been more tired than I realized, because the next thing I remember is waking up. The fire was still burning. Exactly the same. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust. The light in the cabin hadn't changed much. It was still dim, still warm, but something about it felt flatter, quieter. I sat up slowly. My neck ached. My hands were stiff again, like the warmth hadn't stayed with me. For a moment, I didn't move. I just listened. Still nothing. No wind, no creaking wood, no signs of life. I turned my head toward the window. The snow outside had stopped. The sky looked pale, early morning maybe, the kind of light that doesn't fully reach the ground yet. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. They were close to the cabin, pressed clearly into the snow. Deep, clean impressions, just like the ones I had made when I walked up to the porch. But something felt off. I stood up and moved closer to the window. My breath slowed. The footprints weren't leading away. They were leading toward the cabin. From the trees, a single line of them, step by step, coming out of the forest and stopping right at the door. I felt a quiet pressure build in my chest. I turned slowly and looked at the door. It was still closed. I walked toward it carefully, each step slow, controlled. My hand hovered near the handle for a moment before I touched it. Cold, colder than anything else in the room. I opened the door just enough to look outside. The air felt heavier than before, not colder, just thicker. I looked down. My footprints were still there, the ones I had made last night. They led from the car to the cabin, just as I remembered. But there were no footprints leading back. Not mine, and not the others. I stepped out onto the porch. The snow stretched out in front of me, smooth except for the two sets of tracks. Mine going in, and the other set also going in. Neither of them came out. I looked toward the trees. They stood still, silent, watching in that way trees sometimes do when there's no wind. The other footprints came from there. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path back into the forest. They faded slowly as they reached the edge, swallowed by shadow and distance. but I couldn't see where they started, just where they ended. At the door, behind me. I turned back slowly. The cabin felt different now. Not warmer, not safe, just aware. I stepped back inside and closed the door again. The sound felt louder this time. I stood there for a while, not moving, just thinking, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had come during the night. Maybe they had stepped inside while I was asleep. But that didn't explain it. There should have been more signs, more sound, more something. And then another thought came. Quiet, unwelcome. What if they were still inside? I swallowed slowly and looked around the room again. The table, the chair, the bed, the coat, everything looked the same. Still, but now it felt like I was seeing it differently. Like I had missed something before. I took a slow step forward. The floor creaked softly under my weight. I paused, listened. Nothing answered. I moved again, slower this time, letting my eyes adjust to every shadow, every corner. And then I noticed something else. Near the fireplace, on the wooden floor, faint marks, not clear like the ones outside, but there, smudges, as if something wet had been dragged lightly across the surface. I crouched down to look closer. They weren't shaped like boots, not like mine. They were uneven, almost like bare feet. I felt a cold sensation move through me. Slow, quiet, the kind that doesn't make you jump, just makes you still. The marks led away from the door, deeper into the cabin. And then they stopped, right in the middle of the room, as if whoever made them had simply stood there for a long time. I stayed crouched there, staring at that spot, trying to imagine it, trying not to, and without meaning to. I became aware of something else, a feeling, soft, barely there, like a shift in the air behind me. I didn't turn right away. I didn't want to, but I could feel it. That same quiet pressure from before. Closer now. Not outside. Inside the cabin. With me. And as I slowly began to turn my head, I realized something that made my chest tighten just a little more. The footprints outside had stopped at the door, but I never heard anyone come in. Not once. Not all night. Not even in my sleep. And somehow, that felt worse than anything else. I didn't turn all the way around. Not at first. I only shifted my eyes slightly, just enough to look over my shoulder without fully committing to it. The room behind me looked the same as before. The table, the chair, the door, everything still, everything quiet. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed there just behind me, not touching me, not moving, just present. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from crouching. The faint marks on the floor were still there, fatting into the wood as if they had always belonged there. I told myself they could have been old, left behind days ago, weeks ago. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. That thought felt weak, but I held onto it anyway. I turned fully this time. Nothing. The room was empty. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My shoulders dropped a little. The tightness in my chest eased, just enough for me to think clearly again. There had to be an explanation. A simple one. I walked around the cabin carefully, checking every corner. There wasn't much to search. One room, a small space behind a hanging curtain that led to what looked like a storage area. No basement door. No second exit. No place for someone to hide. I even checked behind the door, as if someone could be standing flat against it. Nothing. By the time I finished, the cabin felt smaller than before, less mysterious, just a place, just wood and walls and a fire that burned a little too steady. I told myself I had imagined it. The feeling, the presence, the marks on the floor, all of it. The kind of things your mind creates when you're tired and alone in a place you don't understand. That made sense. It had to. The day passed slowly after that. I didn't leave the cabin. I thought about it once or twice, standing near the door looking at the snow outside. But every time I reached for the handle, something stopped me. Not fear. Not exactly. Just a quiet hesitation. The same feeling I had when I first saw the road. That soft pull, but reversed now. Like the outside was less certain than what was inside. So I stayed. I sat near the fire for most of the day, watching the light shift slightly as the hours passed. It never got bright. Even at what should have been midday, the sky outside remained pale and distant. The sun never really showed itself. I tried my phone again. Still no signal. The battery had dropped more than I expected. I must have used it more than I thought. I turned it off to save what little was left. Time moved strangely there. It felt stretched, slow in some moments, then suddenly gone in others. I would look at the window, then look away, and when I looked back again, the light had already begun to fade. By the time I realized it, evening had already settled in. The cabin grew darker. The fire became the only real source of light. Its glow filled the room in soft orange, pushing shadows into the corners. I remember thinking I should stay awake, just in case. But the warmth near the fire made it difficult. My body felt heavy again, my eyes slow, the kind of tired that sinks deep, not sharp or sudden, but quiet and steady. I fought it for a while. I stood up, walked around, even opened the door for a moment, letting the cold air in to wake myself up. The snow outside hadn't changed. Still smooth, still silent. I closed the door again. Eventually, I gave in. I sat down near the fire, wrapping my arms loosely around myself, and told myself I would only rest for a moment. Just a moment. I don't know how long I slept. It didn't feel like long. But when I opened my eyes, the cabin was darker. The fire had burned lower, though it still hadn't gone out. The shadows were deeper now, stretching longer across the walls. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just listened. And that's when I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Soft. Not mine. At first, I thought it was just the fire, the way it shifted slightly, the way the air moved through the room. But as I stayed still, focusing on it, the sound became clearer. In, out, a steady rhythm, separate from my own. I held my breath without meaning to. The other breathing didn't stop. It continued, calm and even, somewhere in the room. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any sound. My heart had started to beat a little faster now, but not wildly, just enough to remind me that something wasn't right. I listened carefully. The breathing felt close. Not across the room. Not near the door. Closer than that. I turned my head slightly, trying to place it. It shifted. Or maybe I did. For a moment, it felt like it was behind me. Then to my side. Then somewhere just out of reach. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Hello," I whispered. My voice barely made it past my lips. The breathing didn't answer. It didn't react at all. It just continued. In, out, slow, steady. I stood up carefully, my movements small and controlled. The floor creaked softly under my weight, but the sound of the breathing stayed the same. Unchanged. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the room. Nothing. No movement, no shape, no shadow that didn't belong. And yet, it was still there. I took a step toward the center of the cabin. The breathing seemed to move with me. Not away, not closer, just staying, like it was always just beside me, no matter where I stood. A strange thought came into my mind then. Quiet, unwelcome. What if it wasn't in the room? What if it was right next to me? I froze. The idea settled into me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. I became aware of my own breathing again. Shorter now, uneven, and beneath it, that other rhythm. Calm, patient, almost relaxed, as if whatever it belonged to wasn't afraid at all. I closed my eyes for a second. Just one. When I opened them again, the room looked the same. But the feeling had changed. It was closer now. Not just near me. Around me. Like the air itself had weight. I took another step. The breathing stayed. In, out, right beside my ear. I turned quickly this time. Too quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space. The fire flickering softly. The walls watching in silence. I backed up slowly until I felt the wall behind me. Solid, real, something I could trust. I stayed there, pressed lightly against it, listening. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't grow louder. It didn't fade. It just stayed exactly the same. Steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world. And as I stood there, trying to keep my own breathing quiet, I noticed something else. Something small, but enough to make my chest tighten again. The sound was starting to match mine. Not perfectly, not yet, but close, closer than before. Like it was learning, like it was slowly adjusting itself to become the same as me. And for the first time since I entered that cabin, I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't alone in there. I hadn't been alone at all. Not when I arrived. Not when I slept. Not even now. Whatever was breathing beside me had been there the entire time. Quiet, still, waiting. And now, it was getting closer to me in a way I couldn't see. Only hear, only feel. And somehow, that made it worse than anything I could have imagined. I don't remember when I stopped trying to understand it. At some point, my thoughts just slowed down. The questions were still there. They just didn't feel as sharp anymore. Like they had been softened by the quiet, by the dark, by that steady breathing that stayed close to me no matter where I moved. I stayed awake for a long time. Or at least I think I did. It's hard to tell now. The fire never fully went out. It stayed low, glowing in that same steady way. The shadows around the room didn't shift much. They just deepened, like the light was slowly being pulled inward. And the breathing, it stayed with me. It never rushed, never changed. It didn't try to hide anymore either. It was just there beside me, calm and certain. At some point, I stopped moving around. I sat down near the wall again, pulling my knees closer to my chest, trying to make myself smaller without really thinking about it. The wood behind me felt cold through my jacket, but I didn't move away from it. It helped to feel something solid, something real. I kept my eyes open as long as I could, but they grew heavy again. Slowly, the kind of tired that doesn't feel natural. It doesn't come from sleep. It comes from something else, like your body is being asked to rest, even if your mind isn't ready. I remember blinking. Once, twice, then longer pauses between each one. The breathing stayed steady. In, out, close. So close it felt like it was touching the side of my face, even though there was nothing there. I told myself not to sleep, but at some point, I did. Only for a moment. At least that's what it felt like. Because when I opened my eyes again, everything looked almost the same. The fire was still there. The room was still dim. The shadows were still heavy. But something had changed. The breathing was gone. I didn't notice it right away. It took a few seconds, maybe longer. I was sitting in the same position, my body stiff, my neck aching slightly. I listened without thinking, expecting to hear it again. That soft, steady rhythm. But there was nothing. Just silence. A different kind of silence than before. Not thick. Not heavy. Just empty. I felt something shift inside my chest. A small, quiet unease. Because as strange as it sounds, the silence felt worse. I sat there listening carefully, waiting, but the breathing didn't come back. I slowly lowered my feet to the floor and stood up. My legs felt weak at first, like I hadn't moved them in a long time. The cabin felt colder now. The fire still burned, but it didn't seem to give off the same warmth. I looked around the room. Everything was still where it had been. The table, the chair, the bed, the coat hanging near the door. The door. My eyes stopped there. The door was closed, but something about it felt different. I can't explain it clearly. It looked the same as before. Same wood, same handle, same thin line where it met the frame. But it felt noticed, like it had become important without me realizing it. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for something. I don't know what. And then, very slowly, it moved. At first, I thought I imagined it. Just a shift in the shadows, a trick of the firelight. But then I saw it again. The door was opening. Not fast, not sudden, just a slow, steady movement. A thin line of darkness appeared between the door and the frame. It widened little by little, almost too slowly to notice unless you were watching closely. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, my body still, my eyes fixed on that small, growing gap. There was no sound, no creak of wood, no wind pushing it, just movement, silent, careful, as if whatever was opening, it didn't want to be heard. The gap widened further. The darkness beyond it looked deeper than it should have, not just the outside night, something heavier than that, something that didn't reflect the snow or the faint light from inside. Just dark. I felt my breathing become shallow. Slow, careful, like I was trying not to disturb something that already knew I was there. The door kept opening. Inches, more inches, until it reached the same position it had been in when I first arrived. Half open, waiting. I stayed where I was. My hands felt cold again, my fingers slightly numb. I could feel my heartbeat now, not fast but present, steady like it was trying to stay calm. And then, I noticed something at the edge of the doorway. Movement. Not outside. Not in the snow. Inside the darkness itself. At first, it was just a shift. A deeper shadow moving against the dark. Then a shape. Not clear. Not solid. But there. Something standing just beyond the threshold. I couldn't see details. No face. No features. Just a sense of height. Of presence. It didn't rush in. It didn't step forward quickly. It just waited, like it was looking at me. The silence stretched between us, long, unbroken, and then it moved, one slow step, into the cabin. I didn't hear it. I didn't see a foot touch the floor, but I felt it. The air changed, slightly, like something had taken up space that wasn't empty anymore. Another step, closer, still no sound, still no clear shape. Just that same presence, becoming more real with each movement. I wanted to step back, but my body didn't respond. I wanted to speak, but my voice stayed where it was, somewhere deep and unreachable. So I stood there, watching as it entered, step by step, until it was fully inside the room. The door behind it stayed open. The darkness outside didn't change. It just remained there, quiet and endless. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could feel it. Not touching, but close, the way you can feel someone standing near you, even with your eyes closed. I tried to focus, to see something, anything, but the more I looked, the less I understood. It didn't have edges. It didn't reflect the firelight. It was just there, like a space that shouldn't exist, but did. We stayed like that for a long time. Me standing still, it standing closer, neither of us moving. And then, very slowly, I've heard it again, breathing, but this time, it wasn't beside me. It was in front of me, close, so close I could feel the faint warmth of it against my face. In, out, steady, calm, the same rhythm as before. But now, there was no distance between us. I felt something inside me shift then. Not panic, not fear in the way I understood it before. Something quieter, something heavier, like a realization settling in. This thing had been with me the whole time. In the cabin, in the silence, in my sleep. And now, it wasn't hiding anymore. It didn't need to. The breathing continued. Soft, patient, unchanging. And as I stood there, unable to move, unable to look away, I began to notice something else. My own breathing was no longer separate. It had matched it completely now. Perfectly. In, out, together, like there was no difference anymore. Like there had never been two of us to begin with. And in that moment, standing in that quiet, dim cabin, I understood something I can't forget. The door hadn't been opening to let something in. It had been opening to show me that it was already here, waiting for me to finally notice. I remember the way he said it. Not loud, not angry, just steady. Don't go there alone. At the time, I didn't take it seriously. It sounded like one of those things older people say when they don't want you to do something. Like a habit, like a warning that had lost its meaning over the years. But now, when I think back on it, I realize it wasn't casual. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the kind of sentence that comes from memory, from experience. I just didn't hear it that way then. My uncle had owned that cabin for as long as I could remember. It sat deep in the woods, far from the main road, far from anything really. The kind of place you only reach if you already know where it is. When I was younger, I used to go there with him sometimes. Not often, just a few weekends during the colder months. He said the woods were quieter then, easier to listen to. I never really understood what he meant by that. To me, the woods were always the same. Tall trees, long shadows, wind moving through branches, the kind of quiet that feels big but normal. But for him, it was something else. I remember the way he would sit outside the cabin in the evenings just listening, not doing anything, not talking, just sitting there like he was waiting for something. Back then, I thought it was peaceful. Now I'm not so sure. It had been years since I last visited. Life moved on. Work, routine, all the usual things that slowly pull you away from places like that. Then one day, out of nowhere, I thought about the cabin again. It wasn't a strong thought, just a quiet idea, like something had drifted back into my mind without asking. I called my uncle that evening. We talked for a while, nothing important, just catching up, the kind of conversation that feels familiar even after years of distance. And then I mentioned the cabin. There was a pause. Not long, but noticeable. "You thinking of going up there?" he asked. His voice had changed slightly, not in tone, just in weight. "Yeah," I said, "just for the weekend, get out of the city for a bit." Another pause. Longer this time. "You can go," he said finally. "Key's still where it always was." I smiled a little when he said that. Some things don't change. But then, he added something. That same steady tone. "Just don't stay there alone." I remember laughing softly. "Why not?" He didn't laugh back. "It's not a good place to be alone." That was all he said. No explanation. No story. Just that. And I didn't push him. I should have. But I didn't. I told him I'd be fine, that it was just for a couple of nights, that I needed the quiet. He didn't argue. He just said, "Call me when you get back." And that was it. The drive up there felt longer than I remembered. The road narrowed the deeper I went into the woods. The trees grew closer, taller, like they were leaning in slightly as I passed. It was late afternoon when I turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin. The same path. I recognized it right away. Two thin tracks cutting through the forest, barely visible under the layer of fallen leaves and dirt. The kind of road that doesn't feel used anymore. I slowed the car and followed it carefully. The woods felt different than I remembered. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It felt watchful, like the silence wasn't empty, like it was holding something back. I shook that thought away. It had been a long drive. I was tired, that's all. The cabin came into view slowly, just like it used to. A small wooden structure, tucked between the trees, almost hidden unless you knew where to look. It looked the same. Old, simple, still. I parked a short distance away and stepped out of the car. The air felt cooler there. Not cold, just heavier. I stood for a moment, looking at the cabin. Memories came back in small pieces. The porch, the window, the way the roof sloped slightly to one side. It all felt familiar, but there was something else beneath that familiarity. Something I couldn't name. I walked up to the door. The key was exactly where my uncle said it would be. Tucked above the frame, hidden just enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you knew to look. I took it down and held it in my hand for a second. Cold, heavier than I expected. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something faint underneath, something I couldn't place. The inside was darker than I remembered. Not because of the light, but because of the way the shadows settled in the corners. I stepped inside slowly. The floor creaked under my weight. That sound felt familiar, comforting even. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Everything looked the same. The table, the chair, the small kitchen area, the narrow hallway leading to the back room. It was exactly how I remembered it, but it didn't feel the same. It felt untouched, not abandoned, just paused, like no one had been there for a long time. I set my bag down near the table and walked further in. The air felt still, too still. I opened one of the windows slightly, letting in a bit of fresh air. The sound of the wood slipped in with it. Soft, distant, but even that sound felt muted, like it didn't fully belong inside. I spent the next hour settling in. Nothing unusual happened. I moved around the cabin, opened cabinets, checked the back room. Everything was empty, clean enough but unused. I told myself my uncle had just kept it that way. Preserved. Simple. There was nothing strange about it. Even as the light outside began to fade, I felt calmer, more settled, like the place was slowly accepting me. Or maybe I was just getting used to it. I made something small to eat using what I had brought with me, sat at the table, listened to the quiet. It wasn't so bad. Not really. I even found myself relaxing, letting go of that earlier feeling, the one I couldn't explain. By the time night fully arrived, I had convinced myself my uncle had just been overthinking. Maybe he had spent too much time out here alone. Maybe the silence had gotten to him. That happens to people. I've heard about it. The mind filling in gaps, creating things where there's nothing. I told myself I wasn't like that. I could handle a couple of nights. Easy. I stood up from the table and walked toward the door, checking the lock before heading to the back room. Just a habit. Something simple. But when I reached for the handle, I stopped. There was a mark on the wood. Small, easy to miss, right near the edge of the door. I leaned closer to look at it. It wasn't there before. At least I didn't think it was. A thin scratch. Not deep, but fresh. I ran my finger over it lightly. The wood felt rough there, uneven, like something had dragged across it recently. I frowned slightly, trying to remember if I had caused it. Maybe when I brought my bag in. Maybe the door had caught on something. It wasn't important, just a small mark. Still, I stood there a little longer than I needed to, looking at it, thinking about it, and without really meaning to. I remembered the way my uncle had paused on the phone, the way his voice had changed. Don't go there alone. I let out a slow breath and stepped back, shaking my head slightly. It was nothing, just a cabin, just an old place in the woods. I turned off the main light and walked toward the back room. The darkness settled in quietly behind me, and as I reached the doorway, I had a strange feeling. Soft, barely there, like something in the cabin had shifted. Not moved, not changed, just noticed me. I didn't turn around. I told myself not to, and I went into the room, closing the door gently behind me. But that feeling stayed. Quiet, patient, like it had been there before I arrived. And now, it knew I was staying. I didn't notice the basement door right away. It sounds strange now because once I saw it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. But that first evening when I walked through the cabin, opened the cabinets, checked the back room, I missed it completely. Or maybe I didn't miss it. Maybe I just didn't see it the way it really was. The night had already settled in by the time I lay down. The bed in the back room was narrow and stiff, but it was good enough. I remember pulling the blanket up slowly, listening to the small sounds of the cabin adjusting to the cold outside. Wood shifting, a faint creak here and there. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. They helped me relax. For a while, I just lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The darkness in the room wasn't complete. A thin line of light from the main room slipped under the door, soft and steady. I remember thinking I should get up and turn it off. But I didn't. It felt better to leave it on, like I wasn't completely alone in the dark. I must have fallen asleep not long after that. The kind of sleep that comes quietly, without dreams at first. Just a slow drift. And then, I woke up. Not suddenly. Not with a jolt. Just awake. Like something had gently pulled me out of sleep. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I kept my eyes closed, listening. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The small sounds I had noticed before were gone. No creaking. No shifting. Just stillness. I opened my eyes slowly. The thin line of light under the door was still there. Nothing had changed. At least, nothing I could see. I turned slightly on the bed, adjusting the blanket around me. My body felt heavy, like I hadn't slept long enough. My mind was still slow. And then I heard it. A sound. Very soft. So soft I almost missed it. A faint movement. Not above me. Not outside. Below. I stayed still, focusing on it. It came again. A light, uneven sound. Like something brushing against wood. I frowned slightly, trying to place it. The cabin didn't have a basement. At least, I didn't think it did. I hadn't seen one. I sat up slowly, the bed creaking under my weight. The sound seemed to pause for a moment, as if it had noticed me. Then it started again. Soft. Careful. I swung my feet onto the floor and stood up. The wood felt cold under my feet, even through my socks. The line of light under the door looked the same. Steady. Calm. I walked toward it, each step slow, my breathing quiet without me trying to control it. The sound below followed me. Not louder. Not faster. Just present. I reached the door and placed my hand on the handle. Cold. I opened it slowly. The main room looked exactly as I had left it. The light was still on. The table. The chair. The front door. Everything in place. But now that I was standing there, I heard it more clearly. The sound was coming from somewhere in the main room. From the floor. I stepped out carefully, closing the door behind me halfway. My eyes moved across the room, searching. And that's when I saw it. Near the far wall. Partially hidden by a small rug. A door. Flat against the floor. Wooden. Old. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if it had been there earlier. I couldn't. That didn't make sense. I had walked through this room before. I had sat at the table. I had moved around. I should have noticed it. But I hadn't. Or maybe it hadn't been there. The thought came quietly, but it stayed. I stepped closer. The rug had shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of the door. It was simple. No handle on top. Just a small metal ring set into the wood. The sound came again. From beneath it. A soft, dragging motion. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not sharp fear. Just a slow, creeping awareness. I crouched down carefully, keeping my distance at first. The wood of the door looked worn, scratched in places. The metal ring was dull, slightly rusted. I reached out and touched it. Cold. Colder than anything else in the room. The sound stopped immediately. I froze. my hand still resting on the ring. I waited. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. I pulled my hand back slowly. The moment I did, the sound returned. Soft. Dragging. A little more insistent this time. I swallowed, my throat dry. "There's no basement," I whispered to myself. The words sounded small in the room. Uncertain. I looked around, as if the cabin itself might answer me. It didn't. The sound continued. Steady. Persistent. I moved closer to the door, lowering myself a bit more so I could see it clearly. That's when I noticed the lock. It wasn't on top. It was on the side. A small, heavy latch built into the frame, holding the door shut from above. It looked reinforced, stronger than it needed to be. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand. Why would a small cabin like this have a locked door in the floor? Why make it so secure? The sound below shifted again. This time it felt closer. Not physically, but in a way I couldn't explain. Like whatever was making, it had become more aware, more focused. The door moved, just slightly. A small tremor, barely visible, but enough to make my breath catch. I leaned back instinctively. The movement stopped. Then, slowly, it happened again. A soft shaking. Not violent, not desperate, just steady, like something testing the barrier. The wood creaked faintly under the pressure. I stared at it, unable to look away. My thoughts had gone quiet again. Empty, watching, waiting. The shaking continued. Gentle, rhythmic, as if whatever was below wasn't trying to break out, just letting me know it was there. I became aware of my own breathing again. Shallow, uneven, and beneath it, that sound, that presence, separated by nothing more than a thin layer of wood. I don't know how long I stayed there, watching, listening. It felt like time had slowed again, like the rest of the world had stepped back. And it was just me, and that door, and whatever was on the other side of it. Then, without warning, the shaking stopped. Completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I stayed still, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes fixed on the door. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. But as I sat there, something else began to settle into my mind. A quiet realization. The shaking hadn't felt random. It hadn't felt like something trapped and struggling. It had felt controlled, measured, like it knew exactly how much to move, how much to show, like it was being careful. And that thought stayed with me as I slowly stood up, backing away from the door. Because if something down there was careful, if it was patient, then maybe it wasn't trying to get out at all. Maybe it was waiting for me to open it. I didn't sleep after that. I tried. I went back into the small room, lay down on the bed, pulled the blanket over myself, but my body wouldn't settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that door again. Not see it, just feel it, like it had a presence of its own. Like it was part of the cabin, in a way the walls weren't. I kept listening for the sound, that soft shaking, but it didn't come back. The silence stayed, and somehow that felt worse. At some point, I gave up on sleep and sat up. The thin line of light under the door was still there, steady and unchanged. It didn't flicker, It didn't dim. It just stayed. I watched it for a while before standing up and stepping back into the main room. The air felt colder now. Not by much, just enough to notice. I looked at the floor without meaning to. The rug, the door beneath it. Still, completely still. No movement, no sound. I told myself I should leave it alone. That whatever was down there, if anything was down there, it was better to keep it that way. But my eyes kept going back to it, over and over, like something was pulling my attention, not forcing it, just guiding it. I turned away and walked toward the table instead. There were a few drawers built into it. I hadn't checked them earlier. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't think there would be anything inside. I opened the first one. Empty. Just dust and a faint smell of old wood. The second one had something in it. A small device. Rectangular. Black. Old. It took me a second to recognize it. A tape recorder. The kind people used years ago. Simple, heavy, solid buttons on the front. I picked it up slowly. It felt out of place. Not because it was there, but because it looked used. Not forgotten. There was a tape already inside. I turned it over in my hands, brushing off a thin layer of dust. The buttons were worn slightly, especially the play button. That meant it had been used often. I don't know why, but my first thought was my uncle. It felt like something he would leave behind. Something practical. Something quiet. I sat down at the table, holding the recorder in both hands. For a moment, I just looked at it, thinking, remembering his voice. Don't go there alone. The words came back clearer now. He hadn't sounded unsure. He had sounded certain, like he knew something I didn't. I pressed the play button. There was a soft click, then static, low, faint. I almost thought it wasn't working. Then, a voice, my uncle's voice. It was older than I remembered, slower, heavier. If you're hearing this, a pause, the sound of him breathing. Then you're in the cabin. I felt my chest tighten slightly. I leaned closer to the recorder without realizing it. I didn't think anyone would come back here, he continued. But if you did, then I guess I should have said more. Another pause. Longer this time. I told you not to come alone. His voice didn't change. No anger. No fear. Just that same steady tone. But I know how that sounds, he said quietly. Sounds like nothing. Sounds like one of those things you can ignore. I swallowed slowly. The cabin felt quieter around me. Even the air seemed still. I didn't understand it at first either, he went on. Not when I found this place. Not when I started coming here. There was a faint sound in the background of the recording. Wood creaking. Maybe the same sounds I had heard earlier. I thought it was just the isolation, he said. The quiet. The way your mind starts filling in the gaps when there's nothing else around. A soft breath. But it's not that. I felt my grip on the recorder tighten slightly. It's the space, he said. Something about this place, it holds things. The words hung in the air. Simple, but heavy. I didn't believe it, he continued. Not until I heard it the first time. Another pause. Long. Careful. Someone came here before me, he said. Long time ago. Man from a nearby town. No one knew why he came out this far. They said he just disappeared. The tape crackled slightly. I found his things, my uncle said. Some of them anyway. Left behind like he meant to come back, but he didn't. My eyes drifted, without meaning to, toward the floor. The rug. The door. Still, I didn't think much of it, he said. People get lost out here. It happens. Another breath. But then I found the basement. I froze. My eyes locked onto the rug now. The shape beneath it. The edges I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't locked when I first saw it, he said. Just there, like it had always been part of the cabin. The sound of his breathing grew slightly heavier. I opened it. The words came slowly, measured, like he was choosing each one carefully. There was nothing inside. A pause. But that's not the part that matters. I felt a quiet tension build in my chest. The room around me seemed smaller, closer. It started at night, he said. Small things at first, sounds, movements, the kind of things you can explain if you try hard enough. My mind drifted back to the sound I had heard. That soft dragging, that shaking. I told myself it was nothing, he continued. Just the cabin settling, just the wind, just anything but what it felt like. The tape crackled again, but then it got closer. I held my breath. I started hearing it from below, he said, like something moving in a place that should have been empty. The words felt familiar. Too familiar. I locked the door after that, he said, put the latch on, made sure it stayed shut. I glanced at the side of the floor, at the lock. Heavy, unnecessary. Until now. I thought that would stop it, he said quietly. A long pause followed. So long, I thought the recording had ended. Then, it didn't. My heart beat a little faster now. Not loud, just present, steady. It doesn't want to get out, he said. That's not what it is. I felt something shift inside me. A slow, creeping understanding. It wants you to notice it, he continued. That's all. The room felt colder. Or maybe it was just me. It waits, he said. It listens. It learns you the way you move, the way you think. The words came slower now. He was down there too, my uncle said suddenly. I blinked, confused. The man who disappeared, he added. I didn't see him at first, not clearly. A pause, but I knew he was there. I felt a tightness in my chest, a quiet dread settling in. It doesn't take you all at once, he said. It just stays with you. The tape hissed softly, and after a while, his voice dropped slightly. You don't know which parts are still yours. Silence, then a soft click. The tape stopped. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not thinking clearly, just sitting. The recorder felt heavier in my hands now, like it wasn't just an object anymore, like it was something left behind on purpose. For me, slowly I turned my head toward the floor, the rug, the door beneath it, still closed, still quiet. But now, it didn't feel like something hidden. It felt like something known, something understood. And as I sat there, listening to the silence that followed the recording, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. My uncle hadn't left that tape behind as a warning. He had left it behind as a way to explain why he never came back. I wasn't supposed to be out that late. That's the first thing I remember clearly. The trail had been simple at the start, marked wide enough to follow without thinking too much. I had done hikes like that before, short ones, quiet ones, just enough to clear my head. But the light faded faster than I expected. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went, their branches reaching over the path like they were trying to close it off. I told myself I would turn back soon, just a little further, just one more bend. That's how it always starts. One more step, one more minute. until you realize you've gone too far to pretend it was an accident. By the time I turned around, the path didn't look the same anymore. I know that sounds strange, but it's the truth. The shapes of things had shifted. The trees looked closer together. The ground didn't feel as even beneath my feet. I walked back the way I thought I came, but nothing matched my memory. I checked my phone. No signal. The battery was already low. I stood there for a moment trying to think clearly. The air had grown colder, not sharply, just enough to settle into my hands and face. I started walking again, slowly this time, paying attention, looking for anything familiar. But the forest doesn't give you that. It doesn't help you. It just stays the same in every direction. After a while, I stopped checking my phone. It didn't matter anymore. The light was almost gone by then. The sky above had turned a dull gray, fading into darkness between the branches. I could feel the night coming in, quiet and steady. That's when the fear started. Not all at once. Just a small feeling at first. A thought. What if I don't find the way back? I kept walking. There wasn't much else I could do. The ground sloped slightly downward and I followed it without thinking too much. Sometimes paths form that way. Natural lines through the forest. I told myself it might lead somewhere. Anything was better than standing still. The cold deepened as I moved. My breath became visible, small clouds drifting in front of me. My hands felt stiff, even in my pockets. I listened to the sounds around me. Branches shifting, leaves brushing against each other. My own footsteps. That was all. No animals. No distant voices. Just quiet. The kind that makes you feel like you've stepped outside of everything else. Time passed. I don't know how long. Long enough that my legs started to ache. Long enough that the darkness felt complete. And then, I saw it. A light. Far ahead. At first I thought it was something else. My eyes playing tricks on me. A reflection, a break in the trees. But it stayed. Soft. Steady. Warm. Not like the cold light of the sky. Something else. I stopped walking. Just stared at it. It didn't move. Didn't flicker. It just waited. A slow sense of relief spread through me. Not strong. Not overwhelming. Just enough to push me forward again. I started walking toward it. Carefully at first. Then a little faster. The ground became easier to follow as I got closer. Less uneven. Less tangled. The trees opened up slightly, giving me a clearer path. The light grew brighter. Warmer. It felt inviting. That's the only word I can use. Like it was meant to be seen. Like it had been placed there on purpose. When I finally reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped again. There was a cabin. Small. Wooden. Set quietly among the trees. The light came from a window near the front. A soft glow that spilled out onto the snow-covered ground. I hadn't even noticed the snow starting. It lay in a thin, even layer across the clearing, reflecting the light in a way that made everything feel calm. Still, I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to understand how something like that could be out here. So far from any marked trail. So far from anything I had seen before. But I didn't question it for long. I couldn't. I was cold, tired, lost, and there was a cabin. With light. That was enough. I stepped into the clearing. The snow crunched softly under my boots. The sound felt louder than it should have, like it didn't quite belong in that quiet space. I moved toward the cabin slowly, watching, listening. But there was nothing unusual. No movement inside. No voices. Just that steady, warm glow. I reached the door. It was closed. Simple wood. Worn but solid. I raised my hand and knocked. The sound echoed slightly, then faded. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again. A little louder. Still nothing. I stood there, unsure for a moment. Then I tried the handle. It turned easily. The door opened without resistance. I hesitated. Just for a second. Then I stepped inside. The warmth hit me right away. Not strong. Not overwhelming. Just enough to wrap around me gently. The air smelled like wood smoke and something older, something settled. The room was small. Simple. A table. A chair. A bed against one wall. And a fireplace on the other side, glowing with a steady, low flame. It didn't crackle much. Didn't shift. It just burned. Like it had been doing that for a long time. I stepped further inside and closed the door behind me. The sound felt soft. Contained. I looked around again. Everything seemed in place. Used, but not recently. The chair was slightly pulled back from the table. A cup sat near the edge. There was a coat hanging by the door. Small details. The kind that make a place feel lived in. But there was no one there. I called out. Hello. My voice sounded strange. Too quiet. Like the room didn't want to carry it. No answer. I walked closer to the fire. Held my hands out toward it. The warmth felt real. Comforting. It spread slowly through my fingers, into my arms. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time since I left the trail, I felt safe. Or at least safer. I sat down in the chair without thinking. The wood creaked slightly under my weight. The firelight flickered gently across the walls, casting long, soft shadows that moved just enough to feel alive. I watched them for a while, letting my mind settle, letting the quiet fill in the space where fear had been. I told myself someone must live here. They were probably out. Maybe they would come back soon. Everything would make sense then. I could ask for help, get directions, laugh about getting lost. Simple, normal. I held on to that thought, even as something else began to settle quietly in the back of my mind. A small detail, easy to ignore, but still there. I hadn't seen any tracks outside. No footprints leading to the cabin. Not in the snow. Not anywhere. And as I sat there, staring at the steady fire, I realized something else. The flame hadn't changed at all. Not once. Not since I walked in. It didn't rise. Didn't fall. Didn't shift with the wood. It just stayed the same. Perfect. Still. Like it wasn't really burning. Like it was only there. So I would believe the cabin was alive. I didn't hear him come in. That's the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the way he looked. Not the way he spoke. Just that simple thing. I never heard the door open. I had been sitting near the fire for a while, long enough that my body started to relax. The warmth had settled into me, slow and steady, easing the cold from my hands and face. The quiet didn't feel as heavy anymore. Just still. Manageable. I remember watching the flame, trying to make sense of it. It didn't move the way fire should. It didn't flicker or bend. It just stayed in one shape like it had been fixed in place. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was tired. That everything looked strange when you were alone for too long. So I kept watching, trying to see a change, trying to prove to myself that it was normal. And then I became aware of something. Not a sound, not movement, just a presence. The kind you feel before you understand it. Like someone standing too close behind you. I didn't turn right away. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to break whatever calm I had managed to hold on to. Or maybe part of me already knew. I slowly lifted my eyes from the fire and looked ahead. He was sitting across from me, in the chair on the other side of the table, just sitting there. I don't remember the moment he appeared. I don't remember the door opening. I don't remember footsteps. He was just there, still, quiet, watching me. For a second, I didn't react. My mind didn't catch up. It felt like I had always known he was there, like he had been sitting there the whole time. But then something shifted, a small break in that feeling, and I realized he hadn't been there before. I straightened slightly in my chair. My hands tightened without me noticing. "Sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't hear you come in." My voice sounded softer than I expected, almost careful. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me. His face was normal. That's what made it strange. There was nothing clearly wrong. No scars, no expression that didn't belong. Just a man. Older maybe. Hard to tell in that light. His clothes were simple, dark, worn but not dirty. He looked like someone who lived out here. Someone who belonged to the place. But his eyes, that's where it felt different. They were open. Wide. Not unnaturally wide. Just steady. Focused. Like he had been looking at me for a long time. Without interruption. Without pause. "I got lost," I added after a moment. "I saw the light." He blinked. Once. Slowly. It felt delayed. Like it wasn't something he did naturally. More like something he remembered to do. "I figured someone lived here," I said. Still nothing. He didn't move. Didn't shift in his chair. Didn't even change the way he was looking at me. Just still. Watching. I felt a small unease begin to build in my chest. Not sharp. Not immediate. Just there. A quiet weight. "Are you the owner?" I asked. His mouth moved slightly. Not a full smile. Not even close. Just a small adjustment. "Yes," he said. His voice was low. Flat. Not emotionless, just even. Like every word had the same weight. I nodded slowly. "That's good," I said. "I didn't think anyone was here." Another pause. Longer this time. "I am here," he said. Something about the way he said it felt off. Not the words, just the way they sat in the air. Too certain. Too complete. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to ease the tension I didn't fully understand. "I didn't see any tracks outside," I said without thinking. "In the snow." The moment the words left my mouth, I wished I hadn't said them. He didn't react. Not in a way I could see. But the silence after felt heavier. "There are no tracks," he said. Again simple. Direct. But it didn't feel like an explanation. It felt like a statement. Something final. I nodded again, slower this time. My hands felt colder, even with the fire nearby. I glanced at it briefly. Still the same. Still perfect. Still unmoving. When I looked back at him, he was already looking at me. Exactly the same way. Unbroken. I realized then He hadn't looked away once. Not since I noticed him. Not even when I spoke. Not even when I moved. His eyes had stayed on me the entire time. I felt my throat tighten slightly. "Do you stay out here alone?" I asked. Another slow blink. Longer than before. "I stay here," he said. That was all. No explanation. No detail. Just that. I shifted again, trying to find some kind of normal rhythm to the conversation. Something familiar. Something human. "Must be quiet," I said. "It is quiet," he replied. I nodded. Waited. He didn't add anything. Didn't ask anything in return. Didn't seem curious. Didn't seem anything. Just present. Still. Watching. I became aware of my own movements then. The way I adjusted in the chair. The way my hands rested on my knees. Every small motion felt louder. More noticeable. And he didn't miss any of it. His eyes followed everything. Not quickly. Not sharply. Just steadily. Like nothing escaped him. I looked down for a moment, trying to break that feeling. Trying to gather my thoughts. When I looked back up, he was still exactly the same. Same posture. Same expression. Same gaze. Unchanged. That's when I noticed something else. Something small, but impossible to ignore once I saw it. He hadn't blinked again. Not once. Since that first slow blink. I waited, watching him now, counting silently in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. His eyes stayed open. Clear. Unmoving. 5, 6, 7. Still nothing. A quiet tension built in my chest. I looked away again, this time longer. Staring at the fire. Trying to ground myself. Trying to tell myself I was overthinking. People blink differently. Some people just blink less. That was all. That had to be it. I counted again in my head. Slow. Careful. Then I looked back. His eyes were still open. Still fixed on me. Like time hadn't passed for him at all. I felt something shift inside me then. A quiet realization. Not loud. Not sudden. Just settling. He hadn't moved either. Not once. Not a hand. Not a shoulder. Not even a slight adjustment. He was exactly the same as when I first saw him. As if he didn't need to move. As if he didn't get tired. As if he didn't rest. I swallowed slowly. "Do you sleep here?" I asked. The question came out softer than I expected. Almost careful. He didn't answer right away. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then, "No," he said. "Just that. Nothing more." I felt the room grow quieter around us. The fire still burned. The light still filled the space. But something about it felt thinner now. Less real. I nodded slowly. Not because I understood. Just because I didn't know what else to do. And as I sat there across from him, watching him watch me, I realized something that made the quiet feel heavier than before. It wasn't just that he didn't blink. It wasn't just that he didn't move. It wasn't even that he didn't sleep. It was the way he sat there, perfectly still, perfectly aware, like he had been waiting in that exact position, long before I ever walked into that cabin. And now that I was there, he didn't need to do anything else. He just needed to keep watching. And somehow, that felt like the worst part of all. I didn't notice it at first. The fire had been steady for hours, or at least it felt that way. I sat in the chair, my hands outstretched, letting the warmth sink into my fingers and arms, trying to hold onto something familiar, something normal. The glow wrapped around the small room, filling it with soft, golden light. Shadows stretched lazily across the walls, folding over corners and cracks in a way that was almost comfortable. Almost. At first it was just heat, gentle, consistent, like an old, patient friend. But slowly I started noticing little things. The flames didn't move like fire should, not really. Not in the dancing, crackling way I was used to. There were no sparks, no pops, no faint rushes of smoke curling into the ceiling. The fire remained in place, a single, low-burning shape, steady, perfect. And the longer I watched it, the more it seemed aware. I remember leaning forward, squinting at it. Shadows shifted as if to follow the shape of my face. For a moment I told myself I was just tired, sleep-deprived, alone. I had been lost for hours, wandering through snow and darkness, and my mind was making patterns out of everything. That's what I told myself. But then I felt it. A quiet pressure, not in the air, not on my skin. It was deeper than that. Inside me, at the back of my skull. A sense that the fire was watching, not just illuminating, watching, waiting, remembering. I leaned back slowly, trying to shake the thought, but it only grew stronger. I felt my heartbeat pick up without realizing it. My hands went cold again, even with the warmth nearby. It was impossible to describe. The fire didn't have a face, it didn't have eyes, and yet somehow it felt alive, like it knew things, like it held fragments of something that had happened here long before I arrived. I reached out again, letting my fingers hover above the flames. The light touched the tips of my skin, soft as if it was alive in a way that wood and heat shouldn't be. And then, as if my thoughts had been spoken aloud, I saw it, small movements inside the fire. Not in the shape of flames exactly, but shapes, tiny shifts, shadows that weren't part of the room, shapes that reminded me of people, figures crouched, leaning, bending, faces glimpsed for a fraction of a second before they dissolved back into the warmth. I blinked. They were gone. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I was. I leaned closer, letting the warmth hit my face, trying to convince myself that it was just light, that it was harmless, but I could feel it staring at me, pulling me in, whispering something I couldn't quite hear, something terrible folded into the smoke that wasn't smoke. I started to remember small things about the cabin, about the man who never slept, about the way the shadows leaned toward the walls and corners. I remembered the stories my uncle had told me, half-forgotten warnings about woods, about places you shouldn't enter alone, places where things didn't die, places that waited. I shivered, and then I realized I had been watching the fire for hours, long enough that I wasn't entirely sure if the shapes I saw had always been there, or if they had formed after I sat down. There was a moment, a long stretching moment, when I felt certain it remembered me, that it knew I was there, not just physically, but in my mind, that the tiny, shifting shadows were recalling my presence, folding it into something else, something that had happened here before I arrived, something that had been witnessed long ago. I swallowed slowly, the sound loud in the quiet cabin. I tried to turn my attention to the room around me, to the man, to the chair, to the walls, anything but the fire. But the moment my eyes flicked away, I felt it shift slightly. Not the room, the fire, the warmth, the shapes inside. They stretched, bent, turned toward me again, always toward me. I realized then that I wasn't sure if it wanted me to watch, or if it wanted me to understand, or if it wanted me to be trapped by what it remembered. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the fire refused to simplify. It refused to become just fire. I could feel the weight of history pressing against the walls, settling into the air around me, folding into the wood and the smoke and the soft, unblinking gaze of the man sitting across from me. I wanted to look away, I wanted to stand, I wanted to leave, but the fire held me there, not aggressively, not violently, just insistently, patiently, like a memory that refuses to be ignored. And then I saw it clearly, a face, a small, fleeting expression twisted in fear and confusion. It didn't last long, just a heartbeat's glimpse, but it was enough to make me realize that the fire was not fire. It was something else, something that held the echoes of lives, of moments, of things that should have been forgotten but weren't. I froze, my mouth dry, my hands trembling slightly. I could hear my own breathing now, loud in the quiet room, but it wasn't just me. Something else was breathing too. Something that exhaled long before I realized it, and its rhythm matched the shapes in the fire. Not a person, not human, not exactly, but alive. I forced myself to move, not stand, not turn, just a slight shift, just to remind myself I existed outside of it. My chair creaked. The sound seemed too loud, and then impossibly the fire rippled, not violently but subtly. A shadow inside twisted as if in response, a whisper of something too faint to name but undeniable. I swallowed again, slowly. My mind tried to tell me it was imagination, a hallucination, fatigue, anything, but I knew it was. I felt it in my chest, in the quiet of the cabin, in the watching, in the steady glow that refused to die. I remember thinking with a cold certainty that the cabin itself had been waiting for me, that the fire had been waiting, that everything here, the still man, the unmoving shadows, the faint warmth, was alive in a way that didn't need breath, didn't need sleep, didn't need acknowledgement. It existed, it remembered, and now so did I. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run into the cold, silent night outside, but I couldn't, not yet, not while the fire still held me, still remembered, still watched. Hours must have passed, or maybe only minutes. I couldn't tell. The shapes inside the fire shifted constantly, fleeting fragments of lives I would never know, but I felt the weight of their fear, their presence, their longing. Each movement whispered a question I couldn't answer, a story I couldn't follow, a memory I couldn't release. And I realized then that the cabin didn't just shelter people. It sheltered memory. It stored moments. It remembered everything that had happened inside these walls, inside this small clearing, inside this fire that refused to die. I don't know how long I sat there. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. Not because I was afraid, not because I was brave, just because I couldn't. I was a part of it now, a witness, a visitor to something that had existed long before me and would continue long after I left. And in that stillness, in that quiet awareness, I understood the worst part. It didn't need to do anything to terrify me. It only needed to remember. And I would remember too. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, not the kind of escape to a resort weekend, or the kind where every hour is scheduled with something to do. No, this was different. This was supposed to be quiet, simple, a small cabin far from the city, tucked somewhere in the middle of nowhere, where the snow or the trees or the silence itself would be enough to fill the gaps between thoughts, enough to make you feel like you could finally breathe. I booked it online. A simple listing, a few photos that looked cozy enough, and a description that promised isolation, tranquility, and the kind of privacy only a real forest could give. My friend Mark and I, we were looking for that kind of weekend, the kind where no one else existed, just the cabin, the woods, and the occasional crackle of fire. We drove all morning, the city melting behind us in a blur of gray buildings and asphalt. The road grew narrower, twisting and bending into hills and dales, snow starting to gather at the edges, and the trees standing taller, older, more imposing with every mile. We laughed sometimes, made jokes about getting lost, but deep down I think both of us were holding a quiet excitement, the kind that comes from stepping outside the ordinary. When we finally saw the cabin, it was even smaller than I expected, but in a way that felt right. A single-story, dark wood with faint streaks of frost clinging to its roof, smoke curling from the chimney, thin and slow, like it had been waiting for someone. And the windows glowed warmly, invitingly, a soft yellow that promised fire and warmth and rest. We parked and stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, and I realized how empty it was. No neighbors, no distant sounds of cars, just the wind in the trees, the snow beneath our feet, and the faint, rhythmic hiss of the chimney. The cabin felt alive, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made you aware it had history, a story, a presence. Mark was the first to speak. "Looks perfect," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. He glanced at me, then at the cabin, and I could see the same curiosity and unease in his eyes that I felt. I nodded. "Yeah, quiet, exactly what we need." We stepped inside. The door groaned slightly, a long, low sound that seemed too deliberate. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and smoke and something older, something lingering beneath the usual scents. Dust maybe, or time, I couldn't tell. The interior was small, cozy, simple furnishings, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small couch, a single bed tucked into the corner. The fire had been started for us, logs stacked neatly in the hearth, glowing faintly, throwing gentle light across the room. Everything felt intentional, prepared, waiting. We set our bags down. Mark went to the window first, peering outside at the snow, tracing the bare branches with his eyes. I moved toward the table, examining small things. A coffee cup left behind, a newspaper folded neatly in the corner, a set of matches lying near the hearth. Nothing unusual, nothing that immediately struck me as wrong. And yet there was something. A quiet, subtle feeling. The kind that creeps into your skin before your mind fully notices it. I felt it settle in the back of my throat, a sense that we weren't quite alone, that the cabin had already noticed us, even before we unpacked our bags. Mark finally turned toward me, a small grin on his face. "You feeling that too?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's hard to explain, just something about the place, like it's waiting." He shrugged, half laughing. "Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? Remote cabin, quiet weekend, nothing to do but sit here." I forced a laugh, though it came out uneven. The fire popped once, a small, deliberate crackle that sounded almost like a sigh. I glanced toward it, suddenly aware of the way the shadows bent and stretched along the walls, almost leaning. We spent the next hour unpacking, making the cabin ours for the weekend, setting out a few things, getting the small kitchen ready for dinner. The process should have felt ordinary, but there was a weight in the air. Not heavy, not frightening, just attentive. Almost like the cabin itself was watching, cataloging every movement, every laugh, every careful step we took. I noticed small things as the afternoon waned. A chair that had been perfectly aligned would be slightly out of place when I glanced back. The fire seemed different when I looked again, warmer maybe, but also deeper, fuller, like it held more than just heat, like it remembered. Mark caught me staring more than once. "You okay?" he asked finally. "You've gone quiet." I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just taking it in. It's different than I expected." He nodded, satisfied with the answer, but I could see the same unease mirrored in his posture, the slight tension in his shoulders. As evening fell, we built the fire higher, the flames suddenly seeming brighter than they should. Outside, the wind began to pick up, brushing against the cabin walls, making the wooden siding groan softly. The snow had fallen heavier, blanketing the surrounding trees in white, and the world outside became indistinct, muted, almost unreal. We cooked a simple dinner, pasta and canned vegetables, laughing occasionally, though our voices sounded strange in the quiet, like they didn't belong. The cabin seemed to absorb sound, let it out again only in echoes too soft to identify. I caught myself pausing mid-sentence, listening to the faintest creak or whisper of wind, wondering if the place was alive in a way that wasn't entirely natural. After dinner, Mark suggested we explore a little. Just the immediate area, the snow, the woods at the edge of the clearing. I agreed, though I felt that quiet tension building again. We stepped outside, boots crunching in the deepening snow, the glow of the cabin behind us steady, unwavering. The woods were silent, Not the natural silence of snow or trees, but something more deliberate. Every step seemed magnified, every breath echoed, and when we reached the tree line, I realized just how small and fragile we were in the midst of it. The snow stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional animal track, each one a small, frozen pattern in the white. Mark looked at me. "You seeing this?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's perfect, and a little unsettling." We walked slowly, not straying far, but long enough to feel the cold seep through our jackets. And then we returned, the cabin waiting for us, glowing warmly against the darkened trees, the windows flickering with light that seemed almost too steady, too alive. Inside, the fire was exactly the same, perfect, waiting. And I realized something then, something I couldn't explain. The cabin wasn't just a building, it wasn't just wood and stone. It was aware. Not in the way a person is aware, not conscious, but attentive, alive in its own way, holding the space we occupied, the sounds we made, the movements we carried. And somehow it seemed pleased we had come. We settled in for the night, the warmth of the fire in our bodies, the cabin silent except for its own soft, deliberate creaks. I lay in bed briefly before Mark, listening to the wind brushing the roof, feeling the snow press against the windows. And I realized that the cabin was not just waiting for us to sleep. It was waiting for us to notice, waiting for us to recognize that something in this place wasn't ordinary. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just the isolation, the quiet, the weight of being far from everything familiar. But I couldn't shake the feeling that when the fire crackled softly in the dark, when the shadows bent just slightly, when the wood groaned without wind, the cabin was reminding me of something. Something I didn't fully understand. Something that was waiting. And for the first time, I wondered what exactly it was waiting for. I woke the next morning to a soft, golden light spilling through the cabin window, cutting across the room in slow, steady beams. The snow outside reflected it, and for a moment everything felt normal, peaceful even. Mark was still asleep on the couch, a blanket tangled around his legs, and I watched him for a moment, wondering if he, too, felt the quiet tension that had settled into the cabin like dust. Breakfast was simple: coffee, toast, and the faint aroma of the wood smoke lingering in the air. I tried to keep conversation light, talking about the drive, the road, the small birds I had glimpsed in the clearing, but Mark was quieter than usual. He didn't seem upset, just distracted, like he had noticed something that didn't belong and was unsure if he should say it aloud. After a while, I noticed the camera lying on the table, one of those compact digital ones Mark had insisted we bring. He set it down the night before after taking a few photos of the cabin and the clearing. I picked it up casually, scrolling through the pictures from yesterday, noting the way the snow had collected on the roof, the way the trees bent slightly under the weight of ice. And then I saw it. In the corner of one of the photos, barely visible, there was movement. A shadow or a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line. I frowned, zooming in, thinking it was just a trick of light, a reflection in the snow, anything to explain it away. But no matter how I adjusted it, there it was, a shape, faint, elongated, just beyond where we had walked. I froze. Mark stirred behind me. "What is it?" I held the camera up, showing him the photo. He leaned closer, squinting, a slow frown forming on his face. "That's weird," he said finally. "I didn't see anything there when we were outside." Neither had I, not consciously. But now, looking at the image, a cold trickle ran down my spine. The figure didn't resemble any person I knew. It wasn't human in the way a hiker or neighbor would be. Its proportions were wrong, long and thin, the posture wrong, too rigid, too deliberate, and its head, if it even had one, tilted slightly as if watching, waiting. We spent the morning reviewing more photos from the camera. Each one seemed ordinary. The cabin, the fire, the clearing, the snow, until we reached the last set taken just before we came inside the previous night. There again in the frame, movement, subtle, almost imperceptible, a shadow shifting across the snow, bending and stretching as though the air itself were alive. I couldn't make out details, but it was enough to tighten my chest, to make my hands tremble slightly as I scrolled. Mark broke the silence first. It's probably just the snow moving or shadows from the trees. Right. I wanted to agree. I tried, I really did, but my mind refused. The shapes were too precise, too intentional. They followed the contours of the clearing, almost like they were observing us, learning the way we moved, the way we passed through the space. We decided to go outside again, to see if anything could be seen with our own eyes. The snow had fallen heavier overnight, blanketing the ground in smooth white. The cabin behind us glowed softly, the fire still burning inside, faint smoke curling from the chimney. The clearing was empty, or at least it seemed that way. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted unnaturally. The world outside was still serene, the kind of quiet that can soothe the mind or unsettle it entirely, depending on what you're thinking. Mark took a few photos with the camera, scanning the trees and the snow-covered branches. I followed, my eyes straining for any sign of movement, anything out of place. But the forest remained still, patient. Watching, perhaps, waiting. Back inside, we reviewed the new photos. And there it was again. Almost imperceptible, a flicker at the edge of the frame. In one, it seemed to lean forward, its posture deliberate, as if it had noticed the camera. In another, it was closer, the shape now more defined, the elongated limbs stretching in ways that seemed impossible. I could feel my heart rate increasing, a slow, steady drum in my chest that matched the tension building in the room. Mark noticed, too, the way my hands clutched the camera tighter, the way my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the shadows along the walls. "This isn't normal," I said finally, my voice low. The words sounded strange even to me, like I had admitted something I didn't fully understand. "It's here. It's watching us." Mark didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, staring at the photos in silence. And then he did something that made my stomach turn. He played the last video clip we had taken yesterday. The camera had been set on a tripod briefly, recording the fire while we moved around the cabin. At first it seemed ordinary. The fire crackled softly, the light flickered. Then, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, something moved in the corner of the frame. A shadow stretched, leaned, then retreated as if it had been aware of the recording. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer, straining to see. The shadow's shape was wrong in ways I couldn't explain. Too long, too still, too precise in its movement. And then it tilted toward the camera, as though acknowledging its presence. Just for a moment, barely a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough to make the room feel suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I looked at Mark, unable to speak. He didn't speak either. The silence stretched between us, a living thing, almost tangible. We both knew we had captured something on the camera, something we had not seen ourselves, something patient, deliberate, and unseen until technology revealed it. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet observation. Every time I looked at the window, I expected to see the same elongated shadow lurking in the trees, the same watching shape that had appeared in the photos. But the woods remained still, pristine, deceptive in its silence. I realized then that the cabin, the clearing, the snow, and even the forest itself had layers we couldn't perceive with our eyes alone. The camera could see what we could not. It could record what eluded us in real time, revealing traces of presence that waited, that lingered, that observed. Mark suggested we leave the camera on the tripod near the window for a few hours to see if it recorded anything new. I agreed, though with a growing sense of unease. Every step felt heavier than the last. Every shadow in the cabin seemed deeper, more deliberate. Even the fire, steady and warm, felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, as if it too were part of the watching. We went about our afternoon cautiously. Meals, small tasks, occasional glances toward the camera, each one an almost imperceptible jolt in our routine. I could feel the forest pressing in, patient and silent, waiting for us to notice what we could not. When we finally reviewed the footage that evening, my stomach churned. The camera had caught more than the shadows. It had recorded movement inside the cabin itself. Subtle, slow, almost imperceptible. Curtains fluttering though no breeze existed. A chair tilting slightly though no one had touched it. The firelight bending in impossible ways. Shadows stretching toward the corners and walls. And then in one clip, something stepped into the frame. Just a fraction of a second, a dark shape standing at the edge of the hearth, tilting its head, observing. Not moving like a human. Not walking, not breathing visibly, but alive. Mark turned to me, eyes wide. We didn't see that, did we? I shook my head slowly, a cold certainty settling into my chest. No, but it saw us. For the first time, I understood the weight of the weekend we had planned. The cabin wasn't just a quiet place in the woods. It was a witness. It held its own presence, recording what we could not perceive, revealing it only when technology allowed. And what it had recorded wasn't playful. It wasn't welcoming. It was patient, observant, waiting for us to notice, for us to understand. And maybe, I thought, it wanted us to know that we were never alone. The night was heavier than usual, as if the forest itself had pressed down on the cabin, enclosing us in a quiet I couldn't shake. After dinner, I tried to read by the fire, letting the warmth and crackle soothe my thoughts, but sleep felt far away. Every shadow seemed to move differently now, the way the flames flickered across the walls, giving life to shapes that shouldn't have existed. Mark had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I stayed up, listening, trying to focus on the small, familiar sounds. The wind brushing against the roof, the settling of the cabin, the occasional groan of the floorboards. But then, almost imperceptibly, I noticed another sound. It was beneath us. A faint scraping, soft at first, like someone moving carefully across wood. I froze, listening. It came again, irregular, patient. Not a branch falling outside, not the familiar creak of a settling house. This was deliberate. Something or someone was moving under the cabin. My chest tightened. I wanted to dismiss it. Old pipes, perhaps, or the floorboards shifting. But the sound persisted, subtle, patient. A slow rhythm that seemed impossible to ignore. I tried to wake Mark, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe it, and yet every instinct told me something was down there waiting. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved cautiously across the room. The beam of light trembled slightly as I directed it toward the floor. Beneath the rug, I could see the outline of the hatch leading to the cellar, or whatever lay below the cabin. It had been locked when we arrived, old and rusted. I had assumed it was empty, forgotten. Now I wasn't so sure. I knelt, pressing my ear to the hatch. The scraping was clearer, a slow, deliberate movement beneath the wood. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't animal. It was human, or something that moved with a human intention. My hands shook as I pressed against the wood. Each sound beneath it was measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was down there knew I was listening. Mark stirred in the other room. "Everything okay?" he asked groggily. I swallowed. "Yeah, I just thought I heard something." "You're imagining it," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "It's the wind or the cabin settling." I wanted to believe him. I did. But when I moved to the other side of the hatch, the scratching intensified, faster, more insistent, as if it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. My stomach twisted. I had a horrible, sinking certainty. Someone or something was living under us. The floorboards felt colder than before, as though the cabin itself had grown aware of my suspicion. I shone the flashlight along the edges, inspecting for any sign of entry. And then I noticed it. Small, shallow scratches along the wood near the hatch. Not old. Fresh. Tiny gouges, precise, like someone had been working carefully to avoid detection. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. We had thought this cabin was empty, remote, abandoned, or at least uninhabited except for ourselves. But these signs suggested otherwise. Someone had been living beneath us, unnoticed, patient, silent. And judging by the sounds, they were still here. I tried to think rationally. Perhaps a vagrant, someone hiding from the world. But then the rhythm of the movement disturbed me further. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was methodical, controlled, like someone who knew every inch of the space beneath us, someone who had waited for the right moment to make their presence known, or perhaps to observe us without being seen. My heart pounded as I considered my next step. Confrontation would be dangerous. Ignoring it seemed impossible. Each passing second amplified the reality of our situation. We weren't alone, and whatever was beneath us wasn't planning to leave quietly. I went to the cabinet where we had stored supplies and retrieved the crowbar. My grip was firm, though my hands trembled. The thought of opening that hatch, of descending into darkness where I couldn't see, where someone or something was already aware of my presence, was terrifying. But I had to know. I had to understand. I moved the flashlight beam carefully across the floor, illuminating the hatch. The scratches gleamed faintly in the light. Then the sound changed. The scraping slowed, then stopped entirely. Silence followed, so complete it pressed into my ears, making them ache. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The silence wasn't comforting. It was expectant, aware, waiting. I pressed the crowbar against the hatch, levering it gently. The wood groaned under the pressure, small clouds of dust rising. And then the hatch gave way. The darkness below was absolute. The beam from the flashlight barely penetrated it, revealing only rough wooden steps descending into blackness. I could feel the cold air seeping up from below, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of damp earth and something else. Something lingering. I stepped closer, holding the light steady, listening. Silence. Too much silence. And then just faintly the sound of breathing. Not mine. Slow, shallow, controlled. Someone or something was alive beneath us, waiting perhaps for me to take the next step. I wanted to call Mark, wanted to shout, wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused, my body locked with fear and curiosity intertwined. I shone the flashlight down the steps. Nothing, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. I knew that whoever had been living here had done so with care, knowledge, patience. They had observed, perhaps listened, perhaps waited for us to arrive. And now, having been discovered, they were still down there. I considered retreating, going back to Mark, pretending I had imagined everything. But something held me, an uneasy compulsion. I had to see. I had to understand the scale of what was beneath us. With a trembling breath, I lowered myself carefully, the crowbar in hand, the beam cutting through the blackness. Each step creaked softly, echoing into the unseen space below. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying that scent again. Earth, damp wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic. Blood, perhaps, or rust. I didn't want to know. I reached the bottom, and the full darkness pressed in, almost physical in its weight. And then I saw it. A small alcove beneath the cabin, crudely made, containing scraps of old blankets, some food wrappers, and a collection of small items. Notes, photographs, trinkets. Evidence of a life that had been carefully hidden from the world above. And in the corner, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a shape shifted. Quick, subtle, watching, waiting. I froze, the air seemed to tighten around me. Whatever had been living beneath the cabin was aware of me now. It didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound, it simply observed, patient, calm, present. I realized then, with a cold certainty, that the cabin was not empty. It never had been. And it wasn't just a place we had rented for a weekend. It was a home for someone who preferred to remain unseen. And now, that unseen presence knew we were here. I climbed back up slowly, my mind racing, the flashlight beam trembling in my hands. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as though the cabin itself was guiding me back to safety, or back to observation. Mark stirred again, still asleep on the couch, unaware of the discovery beneath our feet. I didn't know how to tell him. How could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? How could I convey the sense of being watched, of sharing the same space with a presence we couldn't understand without terrifying him, or myself further? I replaced the hatch as best I could, pressing down the edges, dust scattering in tiny clouds. And then I sat back in the cabin, listening. Silence again. But it wasn't quiet. I knew it. I could feel it beneath us, patient, waiting, aware. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, every subtle shift of the cabin made me flinch. And somewhere below, I knew someone, or something, was still living, still observing, still waiting. I realized then, with an uneasy certainty, that the weekend would never be ordinary. That the cabin, the forest, and the darkness beneath us held secrets we could never fully understand. And that what lived below was patient enough to ensure that we, too, were now part of its world. We hadn't planned to look at the footage again. After the first night, after what I had discovered beneath the cabin, we agreed silently to leave it alone. The memory cards sat untouched on the counter, small rectangles of plastic holding moments we didn't want to confront. But the unease didn't leave us. Every shadow in the cabin seemed to stretch farther than it should. Every creak in the floorboards suggested movement we didn't remember making. I suppose it was curiosity or something darker that made me pick up the camera that morning. Mark was still asleep, the sun weak and pale through the frosted windows. I powered it on quietly, avoiding the creaking floorboards, and scrolled through the recordings. The early footage was normal. Our arrival, unpacking, laughter we'd barely remembered. Then the footage from the second night appeared. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But as the minutes passed, I noticed small inconsistencies. Shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, movements in the background we didn't recall, a door sliding slightly when we were certain it had been shut, and then on the screen, the movement we had completely forgotten. I saw it first in the corner of the frame, a figure or something resembling a figure crouched under the table we had been sitting at. It wasn't there when we remembered being awake, talking. Its form was vague, shifting, as if the camera itself struggled to capture it. And yet it was deliberate, watching, waiting. I froze, my stomach tightening. I wanted to turn it off, to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a flicker of the camera sensor. But some instinct compelled me to watch, to see what it wanted me to see. The figure moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not like a human walking, but like someone crawling or dragging themselves, careful to remain unseen. I remembered the sounds from the previous night, the soft scraping beneath the cabin, and realized with a cold shiver that we had seen and heard more than we knew. The camera had caught what our ears and eyes had missed. It stayed in the shadows for most of the clip, only partially revealed by the flickering light from the fireplace. I could make out something in its hands. A small object, a photograph, a note. I couldn't tell. It seemed to study it with care, pausing as if considering its next move. And then it did something I could not explain. The figure turned toward the camera, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, the air on the screen seemed to shift. The image trembled, but I could feel the weight of its gaze through the screen, watching us, watching me. And then it vanished as if it had been there and wasn't, leaving only the empty space where it had crouched. I exhaled slowly, the camera trembling in my hands. My heart raced, but there was something worse than fear. A sense of violation, of having been observed in ways we could never have imagined. I thought back to the hatch beneath the cabin, to the alcove with its scattered belongings, to the subtle, patient movements we had sensed and ignored. This footage wasn't just a recording. It was proof. Proof that whatever had been living under us had been active while we thought we were alone. I paused the footage, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I wanted to call Mark to show him immediately, but the fear rooted me in place. How could I explain what we were seeing? How could I convey the slow, deliberate awareness of the presence beneath us without sounding insane? I pressed play again. This time the figure moved differently. It approached one of the chairs where we had been sitting, its movements careful, measured. I could see a faint glint, the reflection of the firelight on something small and metallic. A key, a knife. The details were elusive, as if the camera and the darkness itself were conspiring to keep its true form hidden. And then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, it was gone. The clip continued, showing us sitting, talking, completely unaware of the figure that had shared the room with us. I watched, my stomach twisting, my hands shaking. It had been there, beneath our feet in the shadows of the cabin, and we hadn't noticed. I remembered the subtle creaks in the floor, the irregular noises we had tried to dismiss. Every small sound now took on a new, terrifying meaning. We weren't just alone in the cabin. We had never been alone. The final recording, what we had never intended to upload, showed the figure more clearly, though still distorted. Its face remained obscured, shadowed, and shifting. But the way it moved, the way it paused to watch, conveyed intelligence, awareness, patience. Something that had been waiting for us, observing us, and perhaps studying us in the same way we had studied the woods, the cabin, the fire. I sat back, my mind reeling. The camera was still recording, capturing every flicker, every movement in the room. And then I noticed something I had not seen before, a small, subtle movement behind the couch. A shadow, not on the screen, in the room. I froze, my pulse thundered. I turned slowly, the camera light shaking in my hands. Nothing. Just the quiet, the faint scent of damp wood, the slight chill that seemed to seep from the walls. But I couldn't shake it. I could feel the presence, patient, aware, lingering in the room even as we watched its recorded movements. The realization hit me like cold water. The figure in the footage hadn't been confined to the past. Its awareness extended into the present, into our world, into the cabin. The footage wasn't just a record of what had been. It was a warning of what still was. I didn't know how long I sat there staring at the screen. Minutes, hours. Time had lost meaning in the cabin. Eventually, I powered off the camera, leaving the memory cards on the counter. I didn't dare move to show Mark. He was asleep, oblivious, and I wanted it to stay that way. But I couldn't sleep. Every flicker of light, every shifting shadow, every faint creak in the floor made me tense. The camera had shown us the truth. Someone or something had been living under us, moving among us, observing us. And now we knew it, and it knew we knew. The sense of being watched persisted, not aggressively, not violently, patiently, calmly. A presence that had chosen to remain unseen, to wait for us to arrive, to reveal itself only in the small, subtle ways that the camera had captured. I realized that the footage we never uploaded would remain with me forever. A reminder that the cabin, the forest, the shadows we had dismissed were not as empty as we had believed, and that the figure beneath us, or whatever it was patient, waiting, always aware. I didn't tell Mark that morning. I didn't tell him anything. We left the cabin quietly, packing our things with deliberate care, avoiding discussion of what we had seen. But I knew as I drove away that the presence beneath us remained, watching, waiting, patient. Even now, when I think about that weekend, I feel it. A subtle awareness, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, reminding me that the cabin had secrets we were never meant to uncover, and that some presences, no matter how carefully hidden, never truly leave. We never uploaded the footage. We never spoke of it, but it remains in my mind, a vivid record of something that should not have existed. A quiet, patient witness to our ignorance. A reminder that the forest, the cabin, and the shadows beneath us were alive in ways we could not have imagined. And sometimes at night when the house is quiet and I am alone, I swear I can hear it again. Not moving, not calling, just waiting, patiently, watching. The forest was quiet that morning in a way that felt unnatural, even for early autumn. The mist lingered low to the ground, curling around the bases of the tall pines like smoke from a distant fire. I had been hiking for hours, following the narrow trail that wound through the park, my boots soft against the damp earth. My pack felt heavier than usual, but it wasn't the weight of supplies. It was the sense that something had shifted in the air, something just beyond comprehension. When I saw the ranger, he was leaning against the side of the trail, arms crossed, eyes shaded beneath the brim of his hat. He had that look of someone who had spent too many years seeing what no one else wanted to see. I paused a few feet away, unsure whether to greet him. "You're heading off trail?" he asked, voice low and cautious. I shook my head, just curious. I saw something on the map, a small clearing, and there's supposed to be an old cabin. He straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. That cabin isn't on any of the official maps anymore. Nobody goes there. I smiled faintly, brushing a strand of damp hair from my face. Why not? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a long sigh and looked past me, toward the deeper forest. Because it's the last cabin on the trail, and some things shouldn't be found. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen, people have gone off trail looking for it. Some come back talking nonsense. Others never come back at all. You do well to turn around. I tried to hide my unease, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. I've hiked longer trails than this. I'm careful. He shook his head. Careful doesn't matter. The forest changes when you go off trail. Paths appear and disappear. Sounds you think you recognize aren't what they seem. That cabin is different. Don't go there alone. Don't go there at all. I nodded, pretending to take his words lightly, but the seed of curiosity had already been planted. There was a pull, subtle but insistent, drawing me to that forgotten place. He must have sensed it because he stepped back and adjusted his hat. Your choice, he said finally, and with a slow shake of his head, he turned and disappeared down the official trail, leaving me alone with the mist and the muted rustle of leaves. I waited a moment, breathing in the cool, damp air. The forest felt thicker here, as if the trees themselves were watching, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I glanced at the map again. The trail beyond the ranger's post was faint, barely more than a suggestion. The cabin, marked as a small rectangle, seemed impossibly far, but the pull was irresistible. I set off. Each step away from the marked trail made the world quieter. The birdsong diminished, the wind seemed to soften, and even the crunch of my boots on the forest floor sounded distant, like echoes from another place. I wasn't lost, at least not yet, but the familiar sense of direction I relied on began to fray. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched farther than it should. Hours passed, though time felt different here. The mist thickened, curling around my ankles, then rising to swallow the lower branches. I stopped occasionally to rest, feeling eyes in the silence, fleeting glimpses at the edge of my vision that disappeared when I turned. My pack grew heavier, my legs slower, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Then, just as the light began to dim, I saw it. A thin wisp of smoke rose between the trees. Not high, not from a chimney like a lived-in cabin should have, but curling lazily like breath escaping in the cold air. My pulse quickened. I approached slowly, every sense alert. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if it had materialized from the mist. It was small, weathered, and surrounded by trees that seemed older than any I had passed. Its walls were dark with age, and the roof sagged in places. But there was a glow, faint and warm, spilling from a window, a fire. A light that promised warmth and perhaps company. I stopped a few feet from the threshold, hesitating. The ranger's warning came back sharply. Some things shouldn't be found. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had returned to live here quietly. Maybe a hunter. But the warmth of the light, the inviting glow, pulled me closer. I reached the door and laid my hand on the wood. It was cool, smooth from years of weathering, but there was a subtle vibration beneath my fingers, as if the cabin itself were alive. I hesitated, listening. Silence. Except for the faint crackle from inside, a comforting sound at first, then unsettling. The smell reached me next. Wood smoke, yes, but beneath it, a sharp, acrid tang. Something burned that shouldn't have. I couldn't place it, couldn't name it. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I considered leaving. I wanted to, but something deeper than curiosity, something almost instinctual, urged me forward. I opened the door. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished. A table and 2 chairs, a fireplace with embers still glowing faintly, and shelves lined with objects I couldn't recognize. Nothing seemed modern. No sign of electricity, no canned food, just artifacts of a life long past, or a life that didn't belong here at all. I stepped inside carefully, trying not to disturb anything. The warmth washed over me, but so did the feeling of being watched. Not by a person, not in the usual way, but by the space itself. By the air, the shadows, the way the firelight moved across the walls. A journal lay open on the table. I didn't touch it at first, but something compelled me. Flipping through the pages, I saw names, dates, and observations. Some were mundane, notes on the weather, the forest, the wildlife. But others hinted at something darker. Mentions of people arriving, people disappearing, things that should not be named. The handwriting was steady, careful, and yet there was a tremor in some lines, as if the writer had been afraid. I felt my pulse rise. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to retrace my steps through the mist and return to the safety of the marked trail. And yet I couldn't tear myself away. I had come too far. I had seen the light, the smoke, the cabin itself calling me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had lost all sense of time. The forest outside remained silent, the mist pressing against the windows like a living thing. I realized I had been holding my breath, and when I exhaled, it felt like releasing a small piece of myself. Then I heard it, a faint creak from the loft above, subtle, almost imperceptible. My heart clenched. I had assumed the cabin was empty, but the sound suggested otherwise. Someone or something was up there, watching, waiting. I froze, listening. Another creak, and then silence. I told myself it was the house settling, that I had imagined it. But the warmth of the light, the faint tang in the air, the words in the journal, nothing was as it should be. I didn't sleep that night. I sat near the fire, journal in hand, trying to make sense of the cabin, the forest, the warnings. Shadows stretched long and strange across the walls, twisting in ways that didn't match the firelight. Every small noise, a floorboard groan, the sigh of the wind through the trees, felt amplified. My mind traced every sound to its origin, yet found nothing. Morning came, pale and uncertain, through the fogged windows. The warmth of the fire had faded. The embers were cold, the cabin silent. I stepped outside, blinking against the mist, and looked back at the cabin. It seemed smaller somehow, diminished, ordinary. But I knew it was. I could feel its presence, patient, enduring, waiting for the next visitor. I never saw the ranger again. The trail led me back to the main path without incident, but I carried the memory of the cabin with me, and with it, a persistent unease. The forest had secrets, and some of them were patient, waiting, and the last cabin on the trail was one of them. I told myself I would never return, but deep down I knew the pull would always be there. The warmth of the light, the subtle presence, the air itself. Waiting, always waiting. I returned to the cabin a week later, though I told no one where I had been. Part of me wanted to believe that the first visit had been a fluke, that my mind had filled in details the forest and its shadows hadn't provided. But the pull, that subtle tug at the edges of thought, had not faded. I needed to know. I needed to see what lingered there, waiting. The mist had returned, thicker than before, pressing against the trees and clinging to my jacket as I followed the faint trail toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed quieter, the usual sound of wind in the treetops replaced by an oppressive hush that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest remembered me from before, but deep down I understood it was something else. When I saw the cabin again, I realized immediately that something had changed. Not the structure itself. Its walls, roof, and windows were the same, but the air around it seemed charged, expectant. The light inside flickered in a way that felt deliberate, a pulse, almost as if the cabin were breathing. I stepped closer. The door was slightly ajar, though I remembered leaving it closed. My hand shook as I pushed it open. The warmth inside reached me immediately, but it was different this time. The fire had died completely, leaving only cold ashes, and the shadows seemed longer, reaching toward me as I entered. I began to notice the belongings. Not just a few scattered objects, but things that didn't belong to anyone living here, or anyone at all. Shoes lined neatly by the doorway, sizes ranging from small to large, some worn, some nearly new. Jackets draped over chairs, hats on hooks, scarves folded carefully on shelves, and on the table a pile of notebooks, letters, and photographs. I picked up one of the photographs. It was a man, smiling at the camera, standing in front of a similar cabin. But as I looked closer, I realized the eyes were wrong, too wide, too blank. There was something lifeless in them, not just in the photograph, but in the way the man's expression seemed frozen in time. Flipping through more, I saw children, teenagers, even elderly people. All the same blank eyes, the same frozen smiles. I recognized some of the faces from news articles I had read, missing persons reports from the past decade. And yet, here they were together, in a cabin that shouldn't exist. I stumbled back, heart hammering. How could they all be here? Had they come here willingly, or had something brought them? My mind spun with questions, but no answers came. I moved through the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if moving too fast would anger whatever presence lingered here. On the floor near the fireplace, I found a pair of worn shoes, small and delicate, caked in mud from the forest outside. They were arranged neatly, almost ceremoniously, facing the fire. I felt a sudden shiver pass over me. These weren't just belongings left behind. They were markers, reminders, pieces of people who had vanished without explanation. I sat on the edge of the chair, taking in the enormity of what I was seeing. My own breath sounded loud in the silence. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the marked trail and pretend I had never returned. And yet, my curiosity kept me rooted. I had to understand. I began to read through the notebooks, one after another. The handwriting varied, some young, some older, some shaky as if the writer had been afraid. They were diaries, confessions, observations. Some detailed ordinary life, walks in the forest, meals prepared, the changing seasons. But many contained entries that chilled me to the bone. People writing about being watched, hearing footsteps in the night, doors that opened on their own. Some spoke of strange figures glimpsed in the shadows, always just beyond reach. One notebook had a single page written in large, jagged letters. He never leaves, he waits. We are never alone. I froze, the words sinking into me like ice. I remembered the fire from my last visit, the faint crackle that had sounded almost alive. And now, seeing these words, it made sense. Or at least, it made sense in the way fear makes sense. The way logic bends to accommodate what the mind can barely accept. I glanced toward the loft. The creaking floorboards had returned, faint but deliberate. I didn't move, barely breathing, letting the silence stretch between me and the source of the noise. Another creak, closer this time. My chest tightened. Something was there, something waiting, something that had always been here, observing, cataloging, keeping track. I backed toward the table, scanning the photographs and notebooks again. There were so many. Every time I thought I had seen them all, a new one appeared. Tucked in a corner, leaning against a wall. The realization hit me slowly, like a cold hand tracing my spine. The missing people didn't leave clues. Not because they wanted to vanish quietly, but because the cabin collected them. Because the cabin itself was the clue, and it was patient. A sound behind me made me spin. Footsteps. No, the floorboards were still. The wind? Impossible. The trees outside were silent. My stomach knotted. I realized I had been speaking softly to myself, muttering rationalizations, and the sound of my own voice felt intrusive here, like a trespass. I needed to leave. My legs ached from sitting too long. My head throbbed with tension. But as I stood, something caught my eye. A door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. It was small, squat, and plain with no handle. Just a rough wood panel almost blending into the wall. I approached it cautiously. There was a faint draft of cold air slipping from its edges, carrying with it a smell I could not name. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't decay. Something sharper, something more intentional. My fingers hovered over the wood. I didn't want to know what lay beyond, and yet I did. I hesitated. My mind raced with images from the photographs and diaries, imagining what might be waiting behind that door. And then I reminded myself, curiosity is a dangerous thing in the forest, but so is fear if it prevents understanding. I had to see. I pressed my palm against the door, feeling the rough grain under my skin. A soft vibration ran through it, subtle like the heartbeat of the cabin itself. I leaned closer. The draft of cold air seemed to breathe against my face. And then I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the shuffle of feet across a wooden floor. Then a low, careful sigh. I froze, every nerve on edge. The sound came from within, beyond the door, and it was deliberate. Someone or something was there, waiting, listening, and it knew I had arrived. My mind spun. The missing people, the photographs, the journals, the shoes, the creaking floors, they were all pieces of the same puzzle. And the door was the heart of it. What it hid, what it protected, was something I wasn't ready to face. Something that had collected these lives, these stories, these remnants, and kept them in a place outside normal time. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, aware of the silence that pressed in around me, aware of the patient presence that filled the cabin. I realized I didn't need to open the door. I already knew what it held. The missing didn't leave clues because they were never meant to leave, because they were already here, in this place that existed just beyond the edge of reason. I left the cabin that day, retracing my steps through the misty forest, keeping my eyes on the faint trail that would bring me back to the main path. Every step felt heavy with the weight of what I had seen. I did not speak of it, could not speak of it. Words felt inadequate, incapable of carrying the truth. And yet the cabin remained with me. The photographs, the notebooks, the faint draft from the hidden door, all of it lingered in my mind. Some nights I dream of the shoes neatly arranged by the fireplace, the faces frozen in photographs, eyes staring at nothing but somehow knowing everything. I wake with my heart racing, convinced that the cabin is closer than it should be, waiting for me to return. I never went back, at least not physically, but in my mind, in the quiet hours of the night, the cabin is always there, watching, waiting, holding its collection of people, of lives paused, of stories that never end. And I know if I were ever foolish enough to return, it would take me too, because missing people don't leave clues. They only leave the memory of those who find them, those who see too much, those who cannot forget. I had not intended to return to the cabin again. After my last visit, after seeing what I was never meant to see, I had told myself I was done. Yet, the forest called in ways that logic could not resist. There is a peculiar magnetism in places that hold what should not exist, a quiet insistence that whispers to memory and curiosity alike. The cabin appeared as it always did, half hidden behind skeletal trees, the roof sagging in the same way, the windows reflecting a muted light that seemed almost alive. It had been weeks since my last visit, and the trail had grown faint beneath fallen leaves and snow patches that hadn't melted completely. My boots sank softly into the soil, and with each step I felt the weight of anticipation, of dread pressing against my chest. Inside, everything was unchanged. The scattered belongings, the chairs, the fireplace full of cold ash, these were all familiar. I felt a strange comfort in the predictability, even as unease clawed at me from the corners of the room. That was when I noticed it, the radio. It sat on a small side table I had never paid attention to before, old, battered, with yellowing dials and a frayed cord trailing toward a forgotten outlet. I didn't remember seeing it last time. I don't know if it had been there and I had overlooked it, or if it had simply appeared. Perhaps that didn't matter. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment I touched the dial, a faint static hissed to life. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just electricity, the building settling, the wind outside rattling the windows. I turned the tuning knob slowly, letting the hiss stretch and morph, searching for something, anything, to distract me from the quiet that filled the cabin. Then amidst the static I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, buried beneath the crackle like a whisper carried across a long distance. I leaned closer, the hairs on my neck standing on end, and then I recognized it. My name, the voice said, my name. I froze. It was not possible. I had not spoken aloud in minutes, yet there it was over the radio, soft but unmistakable. My pulse raced. The voice continued, repeating my name, each syllable deliberate as though the radio itself had learned to speak it, to pull it from memory. I backed away slowly, hands trembling. The cabin was silent otherwise, save for the faint hiss of the radio and the rhythm of my own breath. The voice grew clearer, more insistent, weaving my name into a quiet narrative describing things I had done, things I had seen in the last visits, small details only I could know. It spoke of my shoes by the fireplace, the notebooks, the photographs. I dropped to the floor, covering my ears. Logic battled fear inside me. Radios don't speak names. Radios don't know private thoughts. Radios don't track the lives of those who step into old, abandoned cabins. And yet here it was, speaking in a voice that was not quite human, not quite machine, calling me, summoning me, making the past present in ways that defied reason. I forced myself to look, to confront it. The radio sat innocently on the table, dials unmoving, cord slack. But the voice persisted. "Look behind you," it said softly, almost coaxingly. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. Nothing moved in the cabin. The shadows hung heavy in corners, the same as before. Yet I felt watched. Every instinct screamed that I was not alone, that some presence beyond the ordinary was aware of my thoughts, my fears, my curiosity. I realized with a sinking sense of horror that the radio had become more than a device. It was a conduit, a messenger from somewhere between memory and reality, from a place where the missing, the abandoned, the forgotten lingered. I rose cautiously, stepping toward it. My hand hovered above the dial, the static now forming strange, almost rhythmic patterns, like breathing, like footsteps in a quiet corridor. The voice spoke again. "Do not be afraid, come closer." I wanted to step back, I wanted to flee, but my legs were rooted. My mind unwillingly wanted to know what came next, what else the radio held. I adjusted the dial slowly, letting the static wash over me. And then the voice changed. No longer gentle, coaxing, but insistent, almost commanding. It spoke of the forest, of the trail that disappeared, of the cabin that was not on any map, of doors that opened by themselves. It spoke of the people, the missing, the shoes neatly arranged by the fireplace. And always it circled back to me, to my name, my presence, my curiosity. I felt my skin crawl. My thoughts became scattered. The boundaries between what I remembered and what the radio told me began to blur. It described events I had not yet experienced, or perhaps had in ways my memory could not account for. Shadows moving just out of sight, doors opening slowly, whispers in empty rooms. I sat back on the chair, trembling. The radio's voice softened again, almost affectionate, as if acknowledging my fear and fascination together. It spoke of patience, of waiting, of things that moved unseen but always present. I realized in a moment of clarity that it was teaching me, not lessons in life, not guidance, but an understanding of the cabin, of the collection it held, of the weight of time and memory within these walls. And then it said something that stopped me cold. "They are watching you as you watch them." I gasped, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the air thicker. My breath came in short bursts. I could almost hear the shuffle of shoes, the shifting of bodies in the photographs, the silent presence behind walls and beneath floors. I understood then that the radio was not just a voice, but a bridge between worlds, between the present and whatever lingered here, waiting. I felt an overwhelming need to leave, to escape the pull of the cabin, to tear myself from the sound of my own name whispered across time and space. And yet, my eyes remained fixed on the radio, watching, listening, understanding that leaving would not erase what I had experienced. The cabin, the people, the radio, they would follow me in memory, in dreams, in moments of quiet reflection when the forest whispered through the trees. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, I could not tell. The radio's voice became intermittent, drifting in and out with the static, but always calling, always aware. I felt my mind bend, my awareness stretch in directions I could not name. My name, spoken repeatedly, became a tether, connecting me to something older than the cabin, older than the forest itself. Something patient, something waiting. Eventually, I stood. I turned the dial to silence, disconnected the cord from the outlet, and left the cabin. The forest greeted me with its usual hush, shadows pooling in the spaces between trees. Yet the radio's voice followed me in echoes, faint but undeniable. Even now, I can hear it in my mind when the world is quiet. My name, spoken across static, carrying memory, warning, and curiosity all at once. I know I will not return. The forest, the cabin, the radio, they exist beyond reason, beyond comprehension. But in the quiet of night, when my thoughts drift and the world is still, I hear it again, and I remember. The missing people, the shoes, the photographs, they were never meant to be forgotten, and neither am I. I was trained to trust maps, records, coordinates. I make my living ensuring that the boundaries of the world are known, that every structure, every clearing, every fence line has a place in the grid. And yet, nothing in my years of surveying had prepared me for the cabin I stumbled across that morning. I had been tracing property lines along the edge of a dense woodland, a section of forest that official maps indicated as untouched, unclaimed. The trees were thick, their branches weaving a ceiling that made the sun hesitate before touching the forest floor. Snow had fallen a few days prior, powdering the ground in soft white, muffling my footsteps, turning even the faintest creak of a branch into a loud announcement. The first time I saw it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A cabin, small, weathered, its roof sagging just enough to suggest age, but the wood looked too solid, too deliberate. Windows, though clouded with grime, seemed intact, reflecting the gray sky like dull mirrors. Smoke was rising faintly from a crooked chimney. I stopped dead, my boots sinking slightly into the snow. Surveying is about precision, about observation, about skepticism. Every instinct told me to check my coordinates, to verify, to question my memory. And yet, despite all logic, the cabin sat there, as if it had been waiting for me, hidden from maps and records, yet alive in the world. I circled it carefully. The snow around the base was disturbed, not freshly, but recently enough to suggest someone had moved through it. Footprints, too small for a man, too precise for an animal, led toward the front door. My hands itched to reach for my camera, to record, to prove to myself that what I was seeing was real. I hesitated. There is a particular hesitation that comes with the uncanny, a whisper at the edge of consciousness that tells you to stop. I ignored it. The door was simple, wooden, with a single latch. It opened without resistance, swinging inwards with a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside, the air was warmer than the snow-chilled forest, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood or rust, lingering just out of focus. The cabin was sparse. A table, a chair, a small cot in the corner. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that immediately explained the anomaly. But there was a presence in the room, subtle but insistent. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting slightly in ways that defied light and logic. I told myself it was the structure settling, the forest outside bending light through the windows. I told myself I was tired, that the long hike had muddled my senses. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed. I moved carefully, surveying the interior. A stack of papers lay on the table. I approached and peered at them. They were surveys, but old ones, decades out of date, maps of parcels that no longer existed, lines that had been erased in newer records, names written in faded ink, people long gone. And in the corner of one map, almost as an afterthought, a structure was marked. A cabin, not on any modern record, not in any database, just here. I felt a chill crawl along my spine. My professional mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an old surveyor's cabin, abandoned, forgotten. Perhaps the records had been lost. Yet something about the air told me this was not ordinary. The shadows seemed to thicken when I turned my back, and I could swear the cot in the corner shifted slightly when I blinked. I set down the papers and turned toward the cot, noticing now that the bedding looked lived in, pressed and smoothed in ways that suggested someone had recently rested there. My chest tightened. The cabin should not exist, and yet it did, fully formed, breathing with the world as if it belonged there, quietly defiant of maps, property lines, logic. I stepped outside, forcing myself to take a breath of the frigid air. The forest was still, snowflakes drifting down in lazy arcs, and then I noticed the trail. Footprints led away from the cabin, straight into the trees, but after a few dozen steps they simply stopped as if the person, or something, had vanished into the air itself. My stomach twisted. I took several steps closer, following them, scanning for signs of disturbance, for any rational explanation. Nothing. Just snow, trees, and the quiet that seemed to press against my ears. The rational part of me wanted to leave, to document what I could, mark the coordinates, and report the anomaly to the authorities. But another part, a curious, stubborn part, urged me to explore further. The forest seemed to beckon, inviting me to step beyond the edge of reason and into something older, something patient. I returned to the cabin, this time noticing details I had missed. Scratches along the wooden beams, symbols etched faintly into the corners of the windows, small trinkets on the table that did not belong, items collected and arranged as if by careful, invisible hands. Each one was innocuous alone, but together they hinted at a presence, a watchfulness that was hard to describe without sounding insane. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time felt slippery in that place, bending around the structure in ways that made my head spin. I examined every corner, each plank of wood, each shadow that seemed just slightly too dark. The cabin was alive in ways I could not account for, humming quietly, patient, as if it had existed for centuries, waiting for someone trained to measure and mark, someone like me to arrive. As evening approached, the sun slipping behind the forest canopy, I knew I could not linger. The rational mind was returning, the part trained to respect boundaries and property lines. I packed my surveying equipment, carefully noting the coordinates, although I had an uneasy feeling that records would not capture the cabin's existence. GPS would see only trees, snow, and earth. Before leaving, I glanced back at the cabin. It sat quietly, unremarkable to anyone who might stumble upon it later, yet impossibly present, as though it existed in multiple layers of reality at once. I could almost feel it watching me leave, nodding my departure, marking me as another in a line of visitors it had claimed silently over time. And as I walked back through the forest, my footsteps muffled by snow, I knew that the cabin would not remain hidden for long, not from me, not in memory. Its presence would linger, quietly insistent, a reminder that the world is not always mapped, that the lines we draw on paper are flimsy against the persistence of things older, patient, and inexplicable. I have returned to the coordinates many times since, both in maps and in thought, but the cabin resists confirmation. It refuses to be captured, to be filed, to be fully understood. I sometimes dream of it, sitting at the edge of the forest, smoke curling from the chimney, shadows moving in corners where no light should reach. And each time, I hear the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, carrying a quiet message. Some things exist simply because they must, not because anyone has recorded them. I returned to the cabin the next morning, my curiosity tangled with unease. Snow had drifted overnight, softening the edges of the forest and erasing the faint trail I had left behind. The cabin, which had seemed impossibly still yesterday, now felt heavier, more deliberate. Each step toward it made the air feel denser, almost as if I were wading through something unseen, something that had grown thicker while I slept. The first thing I noticed was the walls. Yesterday they had seemed ordinary, weathered wood, roughly joined, nothing remarkable. But today, standing closer, I realized that my measurements didn't make sense. My tape, my laser rangefinder, even my own packing all contradicted what I knew about the cabin's size. It was larger inside than it appeared from the outside. I crouched at the doorway, measuring again and again, and each time the numbers told the same story. The cabin's walls were too thick, not by a few inches, but by an amount that should have been impossible for a structure of its type. My professional mind scrambled for explanations. Double walls, hidden storage, insulation, none of them accounted for what I was seeing. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and noticed something else. The air felt compressed, almost heavy, like the room was pressing in around me, filling spaces that should have been empty. My breaths came slow, deliberate, as if the cabin itself was reminding me that it controlled the rhythm of my body. I walked to the far wall, the one opposite the door, and ran my hands along it. The wood was cold, unnervingly so, as if it had absorbed more than just air from the forest. I pressed harder, tapping, listening. The sound was hollow, but not in a uniform way. It was as if the wall contained cavities, irregular spaces behind it that shifted when I moved my hands. I felt my stomach tighten. I had encountered old structures before, barns, sheds, abandoned houses, but nothing like this. The walls shouldn't behave like this. There was a weight to them, a subtle resistance that suggested something hidden, something that had been deliberately concealed. My eyes traced the interior again. The table, the chair, the cot in the corner, all simple, ordinary objects meant to distract. But the corners, they seemed to absorb light differently. Shadows pooled too thickly, angles too sharp. The cabin was playing with perception, shaping the room in ways that made it difficult to trust what I saw. I paced slowly, counting steps, measuring distances with my eyes, my hands. Every number contradicted the other. I felt a low hum in my skull, a pressure behind my eyes, the sort of dissonance that comes from realizing your world is not as stable as you believed. And then I noticed it, a faint draft, colder than the rest of the room, slipping from somewhere behind the wall. I crouched to follow it, tracing my fingers along the baseboards. The draft wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the wall. A shiver ran down my spine. I felt suddenly very small, very exposed. I had been trained to measure, to detect, to uncover. But this was not something I could catalog. This was something alive, hiding in plain sight. I stepped back, trying to calm my mind. Surveyors are trained to be precise, to rely on logic, to dismiss the anomalies that cannot be immediately explained. I repeated the numbers to myself, silently, over and over. Door to corner, corner to window, wall to wall. They never matched. Each measurement suggested a geometry that could not exist. And yet the room had boundaries, edges I could touch, edges that pressed against me like the walls themselves were aware I was here. I tried to distract myself, to focus on something mundane. I checked the table again, knotting the papers from yesterday. Old maps, old surveys. Nothing that explained the cabin's impossible dimensions. I picked up the maps anyway, feeling the weight of paper in my hands, listening to the soft whisper of snow against the windows. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like wood shifting. Not a creak of settling, not the wind outside. Something deeper, slower. Something moving within the walls. My pulse accelerated, but I forced myself to stay calm, to observe. I pressed my ear to the wall. At first, silence. Then a faint scraping like claws dragging across wood from the inside. I pulled back, heart hammering. My mind raced. Was it an animal, a rodent, a trapped fox? I told myself yes, to anchor in reason. But the sound was deliberate, methodical, patient. Not frantic, not random. It was waiting. I circled the room again, testing walls, corners, windows. Everywhere I went, the sensation grew. The cabin was larger than it should be, its interior impossible, its structure not entirely solid. And always that sound beneath the surface, moving, waiting, breathing in its own way. I tried calling out, a human voice to anchor reality. Hello, the word barely carried. It bounced in the corners, swallowed by the thick walls. No answer. Nothing but silence and the faint scrape, scrape, scrape from inside the wood. I wanted to leave. I wanted to abandon reason and run back to the forest, to the known trails, to the maps that had always been correct. But some force, some stubborn curiosity held me there. I was drawn to the anomaly, compelled to understand it even as my instincts screamed to flee. I spent hours packing, measuring, listening. Snow fell outside, muffling the world, making the cabin feel even more isolated, even more secretive. The walls seemed to pulse now, subtly, imperceptibly, like the heartbeat of the structure itself. I pressed my palms to the wood, feeling its weight, its temperature, its presence. I wanted to believe it was just old timber, soaked and swollen with age. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than anomaly and coincidence. But the walls had stories. They remembered. They contained histories that had never been recorded, events that had never been mapped. I could feel it in the subtle vibration beneath my hands, in the way shadows pooled unnaturally, in the cold draft that never aligned with windows or doors. Something was hidden there, something patient, something that had been waiting for someone trained to see, trained to notice, to arrive with maps and measurements and curiosity, to acknowledge its existence. Night came slowly, the gray light outside fading to the deep blue of twilight. I lit a small lantern I had brought, the flame flickering against the walls, revealing every crack, every imperfection. But the walls seemed unchanged, solid, unyielding, yet somehow alive. I traced each corner with the lantern, and still I felt it. The presence within, waiting, watching. I could no longer tell if it was sentient or simply the sum of hidden architecture, a geometry too complex for human understanding. I tried to leave, but the doorway felt further than it had before, the room stretching, subtly, impossibly. My feet sank into snow as I stepped outside, but the forest felt unreal, as if I had passed through a threshold that had nothing to do with the world I knew. I looked back at the cabin. Smoke still curled from the chimney. The structure stood quietly solid, yet somehow impossible. Its walls were thick, yes, but too thick for what they contained. Something was inside. Something that had no right to exist in our world, yet it did, quietly, patiently, waiting. I retreated into the forest, leaving the cabin behind, though I knew it would not leave me. Its memory, its impossible geometry, its patient interior would linger. And I knew, in some way I could not explain, that I would return, that I would measure, that I would test, that I would confront the walls that were too thick, the interior that defied understanding. And I would find what the cabin had been hiding, or it would find me first. I couldn't shake the cabin from my mind. Even after leaving its impossible walls behind, images of its corners, its shadows, and the faint draft slipping from hidden spaces clung to me like cobwebs. That night, back in a rented room in the nearest town, I tried to convince myself it was over, that my measurements, my curiosity, my unease had been enough. But sleep brought only half-light, fragmented dreams where the cabin's walls pressed inward, stretching impossibly, shifting subtly, shaping spaces I couldn't comprehend. I awoke to a silence that felt wrong. Not the ordinary quiet of a distant forest, but a heavier, more expectant hush. My ears strained, and at first I heard nothing, just the low hum of the heater, the occasional car passing on the distant road. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping like footsteps. I froze. At first I thought it was the building settling, the old wood contracting in the night air. But the sound had rhythm, a slow, packing cadence, deliberate and unbroken. It came from outside my window, or so I thought at first. But as I listened, the impossible truth began to press into my mind. The footsteps weren't outside. They were inside. They were inside something that shouldn't exist. The memory of the cabin returned in full force. Walls too thick, the low, persistent scrape of something within, a draft that led nowhere. And now, miles away in a different building, I could hear a sound that belonged to those same walls. A sound that had no right to exist here, in my room, in my safe, mundane life. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound. The steps stopped for a heartbeat, then resumed, soft, deliberate, echoing through spaces that weren't meant to exist. I walked toward the window, heart hammering, and pressed my ear to the cold glass. The sound seemed closer now, or perhaps I was just hearing it better, attuned to its pattern. Each footfall was deliberate, patient, almost thoughtful. It was not the frantic stamp of an animal. It was not the uneven creak of an old house. It was deliberate, and it was waiting. I wanted to flee, to call someone, anyone, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the room. I tried to remember my training, the rational part of my mind that had kept me grounded in the forest cabin. Logic, evidence, measurement. But logic couldn't account for this. Measurement couldn't account for something moving between walls that shouldn't even exist. I ran my hands along the nearest wall. It felt solid as it should, but beneath my fingers there was a vibration, subtle and almost imperceptible. A rhythm that matched the footsteps I could hear. My pulse quickened. I pressed harder, trying to feel the source, and the sound seemed to respond, pause, then continue. A pattern emerged. Tap-tap-tap, pause, tap-tap-tap. I backed away slowly. My mind raced. I had read about houses with hidden crawl spaces, old servants' passages in mansions built long ago. But this wasn't a mansion, and this wasn't something old. The cabin had been mapped, measured, surveyed, and yet it had held secrets that were impossible. And now, something that had once lived or existed within those walls was following me. Or perhaps it had never left. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of my mind, a lingering effect of the strange geometry, the impossible measurements. But the sound persisted, moving rhythmically, deliberately, through the room as I sat paralyzed in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I could feel it, not just hear it, a presence in the walls, patient, watching, packing, aware. I remembered something from the cabin. When I had pressed my ear to the wall, the scraping had seemed almost intelligent, almost deliberate. Now, in this new place, the sound had become footsteps, measured, slow, purposeful. And just as before, I could not locate them. I could not find the source. They existed in the air, in the wood, in spaces that weren't meant to exist. I tried to leave the room. Every step toward the door was met with hesitation in my chest, a tightening that made my limbs feel heavy. The footsteps followed. I could feel their rhythm, echoing through the walls in a pattern that suggested attention, focus. I was not alone, not in a way I could see, not in a way I could name. I leaned against the wall near the door, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps slowed as if observing me, then resumed, more deliberate, more patient. I counted them in my mind. They didn't match the length of my stride. They didn't correspond to the floorboards. They existed between dimensions of space, in the subtle, unnoticed interstices of the room. Hours passed like this, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless, the rhythmic presence of the footsteps dominating my senses. I stopped trying to locate them and instead listened, absorbing the pattern, letting it pulse through my consciousness. It was like music, or perhaps like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. Morning came, gray and overcast, filtering light weakly through the blinds. The footsteps faded with the night, leaving behind only the memory of them, vibrating in my chest. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in the room, listening to silence, waiting for the next sound, waiting for the next manifestation of whatever had once existed between the walls of that impossible cabin. I thought about returning, about confronting the source, about measuring, recording, documenting. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I could never fully map it, could never fully understand it. The cabin's secrets were not confined to a place. They had followed me, spread themselves into my life, into the structures around me. Wherever walls exist, they may conceal more than air or insulation. They may conceal patience, observation, and awareness. I left the town the next day, drove back through the familiar roads, past the forests that had once seemed inviting. I tried to tell myself that the footsteps were gone, that I was imagining them, that the human mind, once stretched by impossible geometry and hidden cavities, can conjure auditory hallucinations. But even now, writing this, I feel the rhythm in quiet moments. Tap-a-tap-a-tap-a, pause, tap-tap-tap. I have learned to live with it. The footsteps are not violent. They do not chase. They do not demand. But they remind me constantly that the world is layered, that reality is porous, and that some structures, some spaces, hold life in forms we cannot comprehend. I hear them in hotels, in cabins, in apartments. Always between the walls, always just out of reach, always deliberate. I have never returned to that cabin. I know I cannot. Not because of fear, but because some part of me understands that the cabin's presence has extended beyond its timber and nails. It has entered the very concept of space in my life, of walls, of hidden voids, of the places we think are empty. The footsteps are its signature, a proof that some mysteries do not remain in one place, that some things persist patiently where we cannot see them. At night, when the world is quiet and the rooms are too still, I listen. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I listen and I remember the cabin, the walls too thick, the impossible spaces, and the sound that should not exist. And I understand that some presence, patient and deliberate, will follow me forever, walking between walls that I cannot perceive, leaving its rhythm behind, a constant reminder of spaces that are more than they appear. It was the third day I spent back at the cabin. I had come alone against every instinct, driven by the weight of unanswered questions. The walls had already begun to feel alive again, humming faintly beneath my fingers, shifting subtly under my gaze. I could feel the cabin breathing, expanding, waiting. And I knew I was close to the truth. I moved slowly through the rooms I had come to know so well. The main hall, the kitchen, the bedrooms, all familiar now but still strange. The angles never quite matched. Light bent oddly along corners. Shadows pooled where they shouldn't, and I could feel more than hear, the presence lingering behind them. I followed the faint draft that always seemed out of place, tracing its invisible path along the floorboards, up walls, across ceilings. It was in the far corner of the attic where I first noticed it, a section of wall that didn't belong. At first glance, it was just another part of the paneling, ordinary wood grain running straight. But the temperature changed there just slightly, as if the air itself recoiled. I pressed my hand against it. Cold, too cold. And then faintly I heard it, the softest of whispers, like a sigh pressing through the fibers of the wall. I circled the room slowly, examining every angle. There was no handle, no latch, no seam I could see. But the whispers persisted, patient and deliberate. I could feel a heartbeat from behind the wall, slow and methodical, pressing against my chest even before I had found the space. I took a small hammer from my pack and tapped lightly along the wood. The sound returned, muted, hollow. There, subtle but unmistakable, a hollow resonance that differed from the rest of the wall. My pulse quickened. This was it, the hidden room. The place that had existed all along, unnoticed, impossible, waiting. I tore at the paneling with shaking hands, splintering the wood, prying it away slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, something metallic beneath it. Like rust or old blood, I gagged and swallowed hard. There was something in there already, something alive. The opening revealed darkness deeper than the room should allow. No corners, no ceiling, just black that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. I pressed forward, flashlight in hand, every step measured, every breath deliberate. The air inside was thick, stale, and I could hear it moving. Not me, not the wind, not the cabin, it was something else, something aware. I swept the light across the floor. Nothing. No furniture, no objects, just the shadows stretching longer than they should. And then I heard it, faint, almost a moan. I froze. The sound was coming from the back of the room where the light barely reached. Another heartbeat, slower this time, but distinct, inhuman, deliberate. I swallowed hard, trying to keep from panicking. "Who's there?" My voice was small, swallowed immediately by the darkness. No reply. Only the soft movement, a subtle shift of air. I felt it before I saw it. A presence pressing against my chest, patient and deliberate, aware of my every motion. I moved forward, each step echoing unnaturally in the hollow space. My flashlight trembled, the beam flickering. Shadows danced across walls that shouldn't exist. And then I saw it, a figure just at the edge of the light, indistinct, shifting. Not fully formed, not fully absent. I could not see its face. I could only feel its attention. It was waiting, and it knew I had found it. I froze, heart pounding, trying to force my rational mind to override the fear. It was likely a trick of the light, a shadow cast from something in the other room. But the movement, the slow, deliberate sway, it was too precise, too intentional. Something had been living here, hidden, patient, and now it was aware of me. I tried to step back. The air pressed against me, heavier now, resistant. The figure shifted slightly forward, or maybe it was the room itself. The lines between the walls, the floor, the ceiling, they began to blur, subtle at first, then more aggressively, as if reality itself was bending to contain this hidden presence. I could feel it pressing against my thoughts, patient, insistent, aware. I raised my flashlight higher, sweeping it across the space. The shadows coalesced, almost forming shapes, fingers, faces, glimpses of movement that disappeared before I could comprehend them. And then faintly I heard a voice. Not a voice as we know it, not human, not even language. It was a vibration, a resonance that pressed against my skull, embedding itself in my awareness. It was saying something, but I couldn't understand, couldn't name it, couldn't remember it afterward. Only that it existed, and that it was aware of me. The room shifted again. The walls pressed inward subtly, just enough to disorient. I stumbled slightly, heart racing, my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight. It felt alive, this space, like the cabin itself had become a vessel for something patient and deliberate. And the figure, the presence, moved closer, or maybe I moved closer. It was impossible to tell. Time and space had become meaningless here. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady. I reminded myself I was alone, that this was a structure of wood and nails, that my imagination had been stretched too far by days of isolation. But even as I reasoned this, the figure shifted again, more confident, more aware. It pressed against me not physically, but through some unnameable sense of perception, like a weight on my consciousness. I noticed something then, something I could not explain. Faint scratches along the walls of the hidden room, not recent but deliberate. Symbols, perhaps, or marks made by something with patience and awareness. I traced them lightly with my fingers, the lines cold, almost wet. I could feel the presence responding, acknowledging, almost amused. I stepped back, suddenly aware that I had been holding my breath for far too long. My legs trembled, my arms weak. The figure did not attack. It did not move beyond the edges of perception. It waited, patiently, deliberately, watching me. I realized then the truth I had been avoiding. This room had always been alive. Not in the way a creature is alive, but in the way a space can hold intention, can remember, can anticipate. And whatever was here had been waiting for me, for someone to enter, for someone to find it. And now it knew I had. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, pressing against the edge of the doorway I had created. I wanted to leave, to flee, to run, but my body was slow, as if weighted by the awareness in the room. And then the whispers returned, soft, unintelligible, wrapping around my ears like silk threads, tugging gently, insistently. They were patient. They were deliberate. They were aware of me. I fled, not with sprinting terror, but with measured, urgent steps, moving through the cabin, past walls that seemed to pulse, past corners that bent slightly to follow me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The hidden room had claimed its attention. I was merely a visitor, observed and noted. Outside in the cold air, I paused, trembling. I forced myself to breathe, to ground myself in the ordinary world. The wind, the trees, the distant hum of civilization. But even there I could feel it, an imprint, a memory of presence, of awareness lingering in my mind, pressing softly at the edges of thought. I left the cabin that day. I did not return. I do not intend to. Some spaces, some presences are patient beyond comprehension. They do not hurry. They do not need to. And some discoveries are not meant for human understanding. Even now, writing this, I feel it. The awareness, patient, deliberate waiting. Tap, pause, tap, pause. A rhythm of existence that persists beyond walls, beyond doors, beyond our perception. The room without a door was not merely a space. It was a consciousness, and it remembered. I knew the moment we started driving down that winding dirt road that it was a mistake. I could feel it in my chest, the dull, heavy ache that had never fully gone away since that summer so long ago. The cabin had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the woods. And yet, there we were, two cars full of people laughing, joking, pretending it was just another trip like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I hadn't told anyone, not really, how it felt to be there as a child, how the walls seemed to watch me, how the air tasted different, thick with something unsaid. My friends didn't know, or if they did, they didn't care. They only saw the thrill of going back, exploring a place that was legendary for all the wrong reasons. But I could hear the cabin before I saw it, almost calling me back. The road narrowed as we approached the clearing. Trees pressed closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching over the path. The sunlight fell in thin strips through the canopy, making the shadows longer, darker. I remembered those shadows from my childhood, stretching across the walls, shifting when I wasn't looking. They seemed to have a life of their own, and now they were waiting for me. The cabin came into view. Even from the distance, I could see how much it had changed. The wood had darkened, rotted in patches. The roof sagged in ways I didn't remember. Windows stared out like empty eye sockets. And yet it looked the same. Familiar, too familiar. I felt my stomach twist and I realized my hands were shaking, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I meant to. We parked and climbed out. The air smelled of wet leaves and decay. Everything felt thicker here, heavier, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My friends were already moving toward the cabin, laughing, joking about ghost stories, daring each other to go inside first. I stayed back a moment, staring at the doorway, feeling a pulse in the air, slow and deliberate. It was waiting. I knew it was waiting. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the dry leaves. The front door was intact, but the lock was old, rusted, and easy to break. I hesitated. I could hear the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, or maybe it wasn't the wind. A memory pressed against my mind, sharp and sudden. The summer I had first been here, the way the door had creaked open on its own, the shadows that shifted when no one else was looking. I shook my head, trying to push it away. Inside, everything smelled the same: dust, mildew, a faint coppery tang like iron or blood. The floorboards groaned under our weight. I could see my friends laughing across the room, but I couldn't hear them clearly. It was as if the air itself swallowed sound, leaving only a dull, ringing hum in my ears. My eyes adjusted slowly. The walls were lined with the same peeling wallpaper I remembered, faded, warped, and curling at the edges. And in the corner, a shadow moved, small, deliberate, watching. I froze. My friends didn't notice. Or maybe they were pretending not to. I could feel it watching me, waiting for something. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I wanted to call out, warn them, but my throat felt thick, clogged. My memories pressed in, uninvited and unwelcome. I remembered running through these rooms as a child, trying to escape the feeling that something unseen followed me, something patient, deliberate, aware. And now I could feel it again. We explored slowly, cautiously, moving from room to room. I kept to the shadows, avoiding the open spaces where it seemed strongest. I could hear the floorboards creak behind me, or maybe it was my imagination. Every corner seemed to stretch further than it should, every doorway longer, taller, impossible. I tried to tell myself it was just memory, just fear, but deep down I knew better. The kitchen was worse than I remembered. Cabinets hung open, empty, their doors swinging slightly as if someone or something had brushed past them. The table was covered in dust, but I noticed faint handprints, smudges, small indentations in the wood. They weren't mine, not from today. Not from anyone alive, I thought. My heart began to race. The air felt thicker here, harder to breathe. I could feel it pressing, patient, deliberate, aware of me. I stepped toward the back door, the one that led to the small clearing behind the cabin. My friends followed, joking about ghosts, daring each other to go outside. But I couldn't move my legs. I could see the ground, the trees, the way the shadows bent in ways that weren't natural. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like a footstep on old wood. Slow, heavy, directly behind me. I spun around. No one. Just the empty room, the dust motes floating in the light. My friends laughed, unaware. I could feel it behind the walls, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to notice. My memories pressed harder. I remembered hiding here, listening to it move, trying not to breathe too loudly. I remembered the feeling of being trapped, helpless as it lingered, aware of every small movement I made. We moved outside finally into the clearing. The sun was lower now, slanting through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, tried to convince myself it was only memory, only imagination. But I could still feel it in the air, patient, deliberate, aware. We sat around the small fire pit trying to talk about anything else, stories, jokes, the plan for the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself was listening, that the walls, the floors, the shadows remembered, and they remembered me. Night fell and the forest seemed to close in. The trees leaned toward us, the shadows long and unnaturally still. I could hear every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig magnified in the silence. And then I saw it, something moving just at the edge of the clearing. Slow, deliberate, patient. Not running, not hiding. Watching. Waiting. I froze. My friends didn't see it. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. My hands shook. I could feel it pressing against my mind, patient, deliberate, aware. And I remembered, this was why we shouldn't have come back. This was why I had avoided this place for years, why I had never spoken of it. It was not human, at least not in the way I understood humanity. It was patient, deliberate, aware of everything I did, everything I thought. And now it had remembered me too. I tried to leave, tried to convince myself we were just being paranoid. But the forest had changed, the shadows had changed. The path back to the road seemed farther than it should. The air was thick, pressing, and I could hear it, softly, impossibly, from the direction of the cabin, whispering my name. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, watching, listening, trying to stay awake, trying not to move, trying not to breathe too loudly. Every sound from the forest pressed against me. Every shadow stretched closer. I felt the memory of the cabin pressing into me, patient, deliberate, aware. In the morning, I knew we couldn't stay. I couldn't stay. The others were laughing, oblivious, packing their things. But I knew, I remembered. And it was still here, patient, deliberate, aware, waiting. And I understood fully that some places are meant to be left alone, that some memories are too dangerous to revisit. We left the cabin that day. I didn't look back, but I could still feel it, pressing against the edges of thought, patient, deliberate, aware. And I knew in the deepest part of me that it would remember me forever. We should never have gone back. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the roof, soft at first, then louder, a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. I thought it was morning, but when I opened my eyes, the room looked wrong. The shadows were longer than they should have been, stretching across the walls in strange angles. I could feel a weight pressing against my chest, a pressure I hadn't noticed the night before. The cabin smelled the same as yesterday, or had it been yesterday? I couldn't be sure. I had lost track of time. Everything felt off just slightly, like a painting hung crooked. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and the floorboards groaned in that familiar way, creaking under a weight that was mine and yet not. I stepped toward the window and looked outside. The clearing was drenched, darkened by thick clouds, but the trees were still, impossibly still. I remembered this view. I had seen it the day before. Or had I? A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I could remember exactly what the fire pit looked like, exactly where the chairs had been placed. And yet everything was subtly different. Breakfast smelled like burnt toast and coffee, though neither had been prepared yet. My friends sat at the table, smiling, laughing, talking about last night as if it had already happened. The words they used were the same as yesterday, or was it today? I couldn't place it. It was like stepping into a memory that wasn't mine, or a dream I'd had too vividly. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself I was tired, that the stress of being back here was messing with me. But then I noticed something, my watch. The hands hadn't moved. They were frozen, perfectly aligned, pointing to the same time as when I had gone to bed. My heart began to hammer in my chest. That was impossible. Clocks didn't stop. Time didn't stop, and yet it had. I tried to tell my friends, but when I opened my mouth, the words came out wrong. They laughed, nodding as if I had made a joke. My throat tightened. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong since the moment we returned, and I could feel it, patient and deliberate, pressing against the edges of my mind. I walked outside, needing the air, needing to see if the world beyond the cabin had changed. But the forest was identical. The same crooked tree at the edge of the clearing, the same broken branch lying in the grass. A memory, exact and horrifying, pressed against me. This clearing, this forest, this cabin. I had been here yesterday, or last week, or years ago. It was impossible to say. The rain picked up, drumming against the leaves, masking the sounds of the forest. And then I heard it, footsteps, soft, deliberate, slow, not behind me, not in front, but all around, as if the air itself were walking. I froze, my stomach twisted. I remembered last night the feeling of being watched, the patient presence lingering in the corners of every room. And now it was outside, moving with the rain, with the wind, with the trees. I ran back inside, my boots slipping on the wet wood. My friends were still there, drinking coffee, chatting, but their movements were off, jerky in a way that made my skin crawl. I blinked. The same moment repeated, subtly different. The same words, the same laughter, the same coffee cup tipping slightly more to the left. And then I realized my friends weren't repeating. I was, or maybe the cabin was. I tried to leave. I ran to the door, yanking it open, expecting the trail back to the road. But the path curved differently. Trees that hadn't been there yesterday blocked my way. Shadows stretched farther than they should, pressing against the edges of my vision. I could feel my heart racing, my chest tightening, but the cabin remained behind me, looming, patient, deliberate, aware. I ran back inside, desperate, and that's when I noticed the clocks again. Every clock, watch, and device showed the same frozen time. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast, echoing in the cabin. And then I heard it, a whisper, low and deliberate, curling through the air. My name, not shouted, not urgent, just there, patient, waiting. I spun around. No one, nothing. Just the same peeling wallpaper, the same crooked floorboards, the same shadows in the corners. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement. Almost invisible, just at the edge of my vision. I blinked. It was gone, but the feeling remained. Pressing, patient, deliberate. A weight that was not physical, but somehow heavier than anything I had ever carried. The day passed, or maybe it didn't, I couldn't tell. Every meal, every step, every laugh from my friends was the same words, the same sounds, the same movements. And I began to notice the small changes, subtle but undeniable. A chair moved slightly. A book fell from a shelf that hadn't been disturbed. A shadow stretched longer than it should have. I tried to speak to my friends about it, tried to explain that something was wrong, that we were trapped in a loop. But they didn't hear me. Or maybe they were part of it. I couldn't be sure. Every word I said was swallowed, twisted, repeated in their laughter or in the echoing rooms. I began to wonder if anyone was real, or if I had returned to a place where time itself had fractured. Night came, though I couldn't tell when. The shadows lengthened, the rain fell harder, and the whispers grew louder. My name again, patient, deliberate, waiting. I wanted to hide, to disappear, to not be seen. But there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in, the ceilings low and impossible. The cabin was alive with memory, with awareness, with something that had waited for me for years. I went to bed, hoping sleep would release me. But I woke again to the same rain, the same shadows, the same floorboards creaking under invisible weight. I could hear the whispers now, faintly at first, then growing louder, circling the room, curling around me. And I realized it didn't want to hurt me. Not yet. It just wanted me to notice, to remember, to feel the weight of this night over and over again. I tried to write it down, to make sense of it. But every note I made, every word I wrote was the same as the last. Or maybe it had been written before, or would be again. I couldn't tell. Time was no longer linear here. The cabin was patient, deliberate, aware. And I was trapped in its memory, its presence, its careful, quiet terror. I walked the rooms again, tracing the paths I had taken yesterday, or today, or last year. Each step felt familiar and wrong. The furniture, the walls, the air itself, all of it pressing in, whispering. And then I realized the worst part. The loop was not only around me, it was inside me. My thoughts, my memories, even my fear, they were repeating, subtle and slow, stretching longer than they should, pulling me apart piece by piece. The fire we had lit flickered, though no one had touched it. The flames danced, casting shadows that writhed in impossible angles. I could feel them watching me, remembering me, waiting for me to notice the pattern, the repetition, the weight of this night over and over again. I sat silent, listening, patient, deliberate, aware. I didn't sleep that night. Or maybe I did, I could not tell. Each moment pressed into the next, a river that flowed backward as much as forward. The whispers circled me, calling my name, patient, deliberate, aware. And I knew with a certainty that made my bones ache that this would never end. Not until I understood. Not until I noticed. Not until I remembered everything the cabin had stored in its walls, in its shadows, in its air. And so I wait, patient, deliberate, aware. The same night, over and over. I thought leaving the cabin would end it. I really did. I believed that the forest, the shadows, the creaking walls, and the whispers were tied to that one place, that one weekend. But I was wrong. So very wrong. The drive home felt endless, though I can't say how many hours I spent behind the wheel. Every mile I put between myself and the forest felt like it should have been enough. But there was a weight in the back of my mind I couldn't shake. It wasn't just memory. It was presence, patient, silent, watching. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Normal, safe, except for the smell. A faint trace of wet pine, earth, and something older, something that belonged in the cabin, not here. I shook my head, tried to ignore it. It's just the rain on the road, I told myself. But the words sounded hollow. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. My apartment had always hummed with the faint buzz of electricity, the faint creak of pipes, the occasional cough from the heater. Now it was still, almost expectant. I walked through the rooms, checking doors, windows, every lock. Everything was in place, untouched. And yet, I felt watched. I could feel eyes in the corners of rooms where no eyes could be. I tried to sleep that night, curling under my blankets as if I could hide from something I couldn't name. The first time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin. Its walls thick and crooked, the shadows pressed tight into the corners, and the fire flickering like it remembered me. And then I heard it. Not a whisper this time, but soft, wet footsteps. Across my bedroom floor. Slow, deliberate, patient. I opened my eyes. Nothing. My heart thumped, my body stiff with terror. I told myself it was a dream, that I was still thinking about the cabin, that the mind could play tricks, exaggerate memories into nightmares. But the smell lingered. Wet pine, earth, something older. And when I moved my gaze to the corner of the room, I thought I saw it. A shadow that didn't belong, thin and stretched, slipping along the wall, patient, deliberate. I turned on every light I could. Lamps, ceiling lights, even the small nightlight in the hallway. The shadows remained. Not in the corners, not on the edges. They were attached to me, moving just behind my vision. I felt them there when I walked to the bathroom, when I opened the fridge, when I looked out the window at the streetlights. Always there, patient, watching, waiting. I tried to call a friend. I needed to tell someone to make it real, to anchor myself in normality. But the words wouldn't come. My voice faltered, trembling. Every time I tried to speak, I heard a soft hiss behind me. A wet, scraping sound like claws dragging along wood. I whipped around, but nothing was there. My apartment was silent again, except for the faint, wet echo of footsteps that couldn't exist. Days passed, though I couldn't tell how many. Time became slippery, soft, and untrustworthy. Work didn't help. I sat at my desk, staring at a computer screen that displayed letters I could barely read. Numbers shifted in ways that made no sense. And always in the corner of my vision, I felt the movement. Slow, patient, deliberate, like water creeping along the floorboards, pooling in my mind. I started seeing it in reflections. Not clearly, never clearly, but always there. In the bathroom mirror, in the window when the streetlights hit just right, in the black screen of my laptop before it woke from sleep. Thin, twisted, impossible angles, stretching and curling as if it had been designed to be seen only out of the corner of my eye. And every time I looked directly, it vanished, leaving only that sense of waiting, patient, deliberate, aware. I stopped leaving the apartment. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped looking out the window at night. The city seemed unreal, distant. I couldn't focus on faces, on words, on anything that reminded me of the normal world. All I could feel was it, moving through the apartment as if it had been there before I came home. I tried to document it. I took photos, set up cameras. I wanted proof. I wanted to understand, but every recording was empty. Every picture was just my empty room. And yet I could feel it there. I could feel it behind the lens, patient, deliberate, waiting. One night I checked the footage from my camera across the living room. A shadow flickered, moved unnaturally. Not solid, not real, but there, patient, watching, waiting. I began to hear voices too. Not clear words, just soft murmurs, impossible syllables curling around the edges of the air. Sometimes they whispered my name, sometimes they hummed. Sometimes it was laughter, always low, always patient, always deliberate. And every time I heard it, I froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. Food lost its taste, water lost its comfort. Even sleep was a fragile thing, riddled with half-dreams and soft, wet footsteps that echoed in my mind. I began talking to it, whispering questions, demanding answers, trying to reason with something that had no face, no body, but that somehow knew me better than I knew myself. And it answered, though not in words, in pressure, in shadows curling tighter, in the air thickening, slowing my heartbeat, patient, deliberate, aware. I left my apartment once, just to see if the world beyond was still real. The street was empty, too empty. The streetlights flickered as I walked, casting long, impossible shadows. I felt it there, moving behind me in every reflection, every window, every dark corner. I ran back inside. Locking the door didn't help. It didn't need the door, it followed, it always followed, patient, deliberate, aware. I tried to leave the city, drive hundreds of miles away, change apartments, hide in hotels, but no matter where I went, the smell followed. Wet pine, earth, something older, and the sense of presence. I could feel it pressing against me, curling around my shoulders, around my thoughts, around my sleep. I began to see shadows in hotel rooms, in strangers' faces, in dark alleyways. Patient, deliberate, waiting. Friends stopped calling. I stopped returning messages. I couldn't tell them what I was seeing, what I was feeling. Even writing this down feels dangerous. Like words themselves might draw it closer, but it has to be known. It has to be remembered, because the cabin wasn't just a place. The forest wasn't just a memory. It followed me home. It is here, patient, deliberate, aware, always aware. Sometimes I see it in my reflection, stretched thin along walls that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I hear it in the hum of electricity, in the creak of pipes. Sometimes it whispers my name just softly enough that I know it could be mistaken for my own thoughts. And I know that it's waiting for me to notice the loop I am trapped in now. Waiting to remind me that leaving the forest never ends the forest. I don't sleep well, I don't eat well, I barely leave my apartment. And yet I can feel it in every shadow, in every corner, in every silence. Patient, deliberate, aware. And I know it will never stop. Not while I live. Not while I breathe. Not while I remember that cabin, that forest, that night. It followed me home. And now there is no escape.